called it, to the lowest. This detail of itself should have sufficed to have demonstrated to Proctor, or any other astronomer, that the astrological week had been foisted upon the already existing week of the Jews. Before astrology took its present mathematical form, astrologers used as their material for prediction the stars or constellations which happened to be rising or setting at the time selected, or were upon the same meridian, or had the same longitude, as such constellations. One of the earliest of these astrological writers was Zuchros of Babylon, who lived about the time of the Christian era, some of whose writings have been preserved to us. From these it is clear that the astrologers found 12 signs of the zodiac did not give them enough play. They therefore introduced the decans, that is to say the idea of 36 divinities, 3 to each month, borrowed from the Egyptian division of the year into 36 weeks, of 10 days, each under the rule of a separate god. Of course this Egyptian year bore no fixed relation to the actual lunar months or solar year, nor therefore to the Jewish year, which was related to both. But even with this increase of material, the astrologers found the astronomical data insufficient for their fortune-telling purposes. Additional figures quite unrepresented in the heavens, were devised, and were drawn upon, as needed, to supplement the genuine constellations, and as it was impossible to recognize these additions in the sky, the predictions were made, not from observation of the heavens, but from observations on globes, often very inaccurate. Earlier still we have astrological tablets from Assyria and Babylon, many of which show that they had nothing to do with any actual observation, and were simply invented to give completeness to the tables of omens. Thus an Assyrian tablet has been found upon which are given the significations of eclipses falling upon each day of the month Tammuz, right up to the middle of the month. It is amusing to read the naive comment of a distinguished Assyriologist, that tablets such as these prove how careful, and how long continued had been the observations upon which they were based. It was not recognized that no eclipses either of sun or moon could possibly occur on most of the dates given, and that they could never occur in the north, which is one of the quarters indicated. They were no more founded on actual observation than the portent mentioned on another tablet, of a woman giving birth to a lion, which, after all, is not more impossible than that an eclipse should occur in the north on the second day of Tammuz. In all ages it has been the same. The astrologer has had nothing to do with science as such, even in its most primitive form. He has cared nothing for the actual appearance of the heavens upon which he pretended to base his predictions. An imaginary planet, an imaginary eclipse, an imaginary constellation were just as good for his fortune-telling as real ones. Such fortune-telling was forbidden to the Hebrews, necessarily forbidden, for astrology had no excuse unless the stars and planets were gods, or the vehicles and engines of gods. Further, all attempts to extort from spirits or from inanimate things a glimpse into the future was likewise forbidden them. They were to look to God, and to his revealed will alone for all such light. When they shall say unto you, Seek unto them that have familiar spirits, and unto wizards that peep, and that mutter, should not a people seek unto their God? The Hebrews were few in number, their kingdoms very small compared with the great empires of Egypt, Assyria, or Babylon, but here, in this question of divination or fortune-telling, they stand on a plane far above any of the surrounding nations. There is just contempt in the picture drawn by Ezekiel of the king of Babylon. Great though his military power might be, the king of Babylon stood at the parting of the way, at the head of the two ways, to use divination. He shook the arrows to and fro, he consulted the teraphim, he looked in the liver. And Isaiah calls upon the city of Babylon, Stand now with thine enchantments, and with the multitude of thy sorceries, wherein thou hast labored from thy youth, if so thou shalt be able to profit, if so be thou mayest prevail. Thou art wearied in the multitude of thy counsels. Let now the astrologers, the stargazers, the monthly prognosticators stand up, and save thee from these things that shall come upon thee. Isaiah knew the Lord to be he that frustrateth the tokens of the liars and mocketh diviners mad. And the word of the Lord to Israel through Jeremiah was, Thus saith the Lord. Learn not the way of the heathen, and be not dismayed at the signs of heaven, for the heathen are dismayed at them. It is to our shame that even today, in spite of all our enlightenment and scientific advances, astrology still has a hold upon multitudes. Astrological almanacs and treatises are sold by the tens of thousands, and astrological superstitions are still current. The star of the god Chiron is not indeed openly worshipped, but Saturn is still looked upon as the planet bringing such diseases as toothache, agues, and all that proceeds from cold, consumption, the spleen particularly, and the bones, rheumatic gouts, jaundice, dropsy, and all complaints arising from fear, apoplexies, etc. And charms made of Saturn's metal, lead, are still worn upon Saturn's finger, in the belief that these will ward off the threatened evil, a tradition of the time when by so doing the wearers would have proclaimed themselves votaries of the god, and therefore under his protection. Astrology is inevitably linked with heathenism, and both shut up spirit and mind against the knowledge of God himself, which is religion, and against the knowledge of his works, which is science. And though a man may be religious without being scientific, or scientific without being religious, religion and science alike both rest on one and the same basis, the belief in one God, maker of heaven and earth. That belief was the reason why Israel of old, so far as it was faithful to it, was free from the superstitions of astrology. It is no small honor for this nation to have been wise enough to see the inanity of this and all other forms of divination. Of what other ancient civilized nation could as much be said? 145:1, footnotes, 136:1, are, Proctor, The Great Pyramid, pages 274 to 276. 139:1, G. V. Schiaparelli, Astronomy in the Old Testament, p. 137, 145:1, G. V. Schiaparelli, Astronomy in the Old Testament, page 52. St. Paul preaching at Athens by permission of the Audiotype Company 74, New Oxford Street, London, W. C. St. Paul preaching at Athens, by Raphael. As certain also of your own poets have said, for we are also his offspring. To list Book 2 The Constellations Chapter I The origin of the constellations. The age of classical astronomy began with the labors of Eudoxus and others, about 4 centuries before the Christian era, but there was an earlier astronomy whose chief feature was the arrangement of the stars into constellations. The best known of all such arrangements is that sometimes called the Greek sphere, because those constellations have been preserved to us by Greek astronomers and poets. The earliest complete catalogue of the stars, as thus arranged, that has come down to us was compiled by Claudius Ptolemy, the astronomer of Alexandria, and completed 137 AD. In this catalogue, each star is described by its place in the supposed figure of the constellation, whilst its celestial latitude and longitude are added, so that we can see with considerable exactness how the astronomers of that time imagined the star figures. The earliest complete description of the constellations, apart from the places of the individual stars, is given in the poem of Aratus of Soli, The Phenomena, published about 270 B.C., were these constellations known to the Hebrews of old? We can answer this question without hesitation in the case of St. Paul. For in his sermon to the Athenians on Mars Hill, he quotes from the opening verses of this constellation poem of Aratus, God that made the world and all things therein, seeing that he is Lord of heaven and earth, dwelleth not in temples made with hands, neither is worshipped with men's hands, as though he needed anything, seeing he giveth to all life and breath, and all things, and hath made of one blood all nations of men for to dwell on all the face of the earth, and hath determined the times before appointed, and the bounds of their habitation, that they should seek the Lord, if haply they might feel after him, and find him, though he be not far from every one of us, for in him we live, and move, and have our being, as certain also of your own poets have said, for we are also his offspring. The poem of Aratus begins thus, To God above we dedicate our song, to leave him unadored, we never dare, for he is present in each busy throng, in every solemn gathering he is there. The sea is his, and his each crowded port, in every place our need of him we feel, for we his offspring are. Aratus, like St. Paul himself, was a native of Cilicia, and had been educated at Athens. His poem on the constellations came, in the opinion of the Greeks, next in honor to the poems of Homer, so that St. Paul's quotation from it appealed to his hearers with special force. The constellations of Ptolemy's catalogue are 48 in number. Those of Aratus correspond to them in almost every particular, but one or two minor differences may be marked. According to Ptolemy, the constellations are divided into 3 sets, 21 northern, 12 in the zodiac, and 15 southern. The northern constellations are, to use the names by which they are now familiar to us, 1. Ursa Minor, the Little Bear, 2. Ursa Major, the Great Bear, 3. Draco, the Dragon, 4. Cepheus, the King, 5. Boötes, the Herdsman, 6. Corona Borealis, the Northern Crown, 7. Hercules, the Kneeler, 8. Lyra, the Lyre or Swooping Eagle, 9. Cygnus, the Bird, 10. Cassiopeia, the Throned Queen, or the Lady in the Chair, 11. Perseus, 12. Auriga, the Holder of the Reins, 13. Ophiuchus, the Serpent Holder, 14. Serpens, the Serpent, 15. Sagitta, the Arrow, 16. Aquila, the Soaring Eagle, 17. Delphinus, the Dolphin, 18. Equuleus, the Horse's Head, 19. Pegasus, the Winged Horse, 20. Andromeda, the Chained Woman, 21. Triangulum, the Triangle. The zodiacal constellations are, 1. Aries, the Ram, 2. Taurus, the Bull, 3. Gemini, the Twins, 4. Cancer, the Crab, 5. Leo, the Lion, 6. Virgo, the Virgin, 7. Libra, the Scales, also called the Claws, that is of the Scorpion, 8. Scorpio, the Scorpion, 9. Sagittarius, the Archer, 10. Capricornus, the Sea-Goat, i.e. Goatfish, 11. Aquarius, the Water-Pourer, 12. Pisces, the Fishes. The southern constellations are, 1. Cetus, the Sea Monster, 2. Orion, the Giant, 3. Eridanus, the River, 4. Lepus, the Hare, 5. Canis Major, the Great Dog, 6. Canis Minor, the Little Dog, 7. Argo, the Ship and Rock, 8. Hydra, the Water Snake, 9. Crater, the Cup, 10. Corvus, the Raven, 11. Centaurus, the Centaur, 12. Lupus, the Beast, 13. Era, the Altar, 14. Corona Australis, the Southern Crown, 15. Piscis Australis, the Southern Fish. Aratus, living 400 years earlier than Ptolemy, differs only from him in that he reckons the cluster of the Pleiades, counted by Ptolemy in Taurus, as a separate constellation, but he has no constellation of Equuleus. The total number of constellations was thus still 48. Aratus further describes the Southern Crown, but gives it no name, and in the constellation of the Little Dog he only mentions one star, Procyon, the dog's forerunner. He also mentions that the 2 bears were also known as 2 wagons or chariots. Were these constellations, so familiar to us today, known before the time of Aratus, and if so, by whom were they devised, and when and where? They were certainly known before the time of Aratus, for his poem was confessedly a versification of an account of them written by Eudoxus more than 100 years previous. At a yet earlier date, Panyacesis, uncle to the great historian Herodotus, incidentally discusses the name of one of the constellations, which must therefore have been known to him. Earlier still, Hesiod, in the 2nd book of his Works and Days, refers to several, Orion and the Dog, each other nigh, together mounted to the midnight sky, when in the rosy morn Arcturus shines, then pluck the clusters from the parent vines. Next in the round do not to plough forget when the 7 virgins and Orion set. Much the same constellations are referred to by Homer. Thus, in the 5th book of the Odyssey, and now, rejoicing in the prosperous gales, with beating heart Ulysses spreads his sails, placed at the helm he sate, and marked the skies, nor closed in sleep his ever-watchful eyes. There viewed the Pleiades and the northern team, and great Orion's more refulgent beam, to which around the axle of the sky the bear, revolving, points his golden eye. Thus it is clear that several of the constellations were perfectly familiar to the Greeks 1,000 years before the Christian era, that is to say, about the time of Solomon. We have other evidence that the constellations were known in early times. We often find on Greek coins, a bull, a ram, or a lion represented. These may well be references to some of the signs of the zodiac, but offer no conclusive evidence. But several of the constellation figures are very unusual in form, thus the sea-goat has the head and forelegs of a goat, but the hinder part of a fish, and the archer has the head and shoulders of a man, but the body and legs of a horse. Pegasus, the horse with wings, not only shows this unnatural combination, but the constellation figure only gives part of the animal, the head, neck, wings, breast, and forelegs. Now some of these characteristic figures are found on quite early Greek coins, and yet earlier on what are known as boundary stones, from Babylonia. These are little square pillars, covered with inscriptions and sculptures, and record for the most part the gift, transfer, or sale of land. They are dated according to the year of the reigning king, so that a clear idea can be formed as to their age. A great many symbols, which appear to be astronomical, occur upon them, amongst these such very distinguishing shapes as the archer, sea-goat and scorpion, see page 318. So that, just as we know from Homer and Hesiod that the principal constellations were known of old by the same names as those by which we know them today, we learn from Babylonian boundary stones that they were then known as having the same forms as we now ascribe to them. The date of the earliest boundary stones of the kind in our possession would show that the Babylonians knew of our constellations as far back as the 12th century B.C., that is to say, whilst Israel was under the judges. We have direct evidence thus far back as to the existence of the constellations. But they are older than this, so much older that tradition as well as direct historical evidence fails us. The only earlier evidence open to us is that of the constellations themselves. A modern celestial globe is covered over with figures from pole to pole, but the majority of these are of quite recent origin and belong to the modern period of astronomy. They have been framed since the invention of the telescope, and since the progress of geographical discovery brought men to know the southern skies. If these modern constellations are cleared off, and only those of Aratus and Ptolemy suffered to remain, it becomes at once evident that the ancient astronomers were not acquainted with the entire heavens. For there is a large space in the south, left free from all the old constellations, and no explanation, why it should have been so left free, is so simple and satisfactory as the obvious one, that the ancient astronomers did not map out the stars in that region because they never saw them, those stars never rose above their horizon. The ancient constellations south of the ecliptic. The ancient constellations south of the ecliptic. To list thus at the present time the heavens for an observer in England are naturally divided into three parts, as shown in the accompanying diagram. In the north, round the pole star are a number of constellations that never set, they will unceasingly around the pole. On every fine night we can see the Great Bear, the Little Bear, the Dragon, Cepheus and Cassiopeia. But the stars in the larger portion of the sky have their risings and settings, and the seasons in which they are visible or are withdrawn from sight. Thus we see Orion and the Pleiades and Sirius in the winter, not in the summer, but the Scorpion and Sagittarius in the summer. Similarly there is a third portion of the heavens which never comes within our range. We never see the Southern Cross, and hardly any star in the great constellation of the Ship, though these are very familiar to New Zealanders. The celestial sphere. The celestial sphere. To list the outline of this unmapped region must therefore correspond roughly to the horizon of the place where the constellations were originally designed, or at least be roughly parallel to it, since we may well suppose that stars which only rose 2 or 3 degrees above that horizon might have been neglected. From this we learn that the constellations were designed by people living not very far from the 40th parallel of north latitude, not further south than the 37th or 36th. This is important, as it shows that they did not originate in ancient Egypt or India, nor even in the city of Babylon, which is in latitude 32 to 1/2 degree. 157:1, but this vacant space reveals another fact of even more importance. It gives us a hint as to the date when the constellations were designed. An observer in north latitude 40 degrees at the present time would be very far from seeing all the stars included in the 48 constellations. He would see nothing at all of the constellation of the Altar, and a good deal of that of the Centaur would be hidden from him. On the other hand, there are some bright constellations, such as the Phoenix and the Crane, unknown to the ancients, which would come within his range of vision. This is due to what is known as precession, a slow movement of the axis upon which the Earth rotates. In consequence of this, the pole of the heavens seems to trace out a circle amongst the stars which it takes 25,800 years to complete. It is therefore a matter of very simple calculation to find the position of the south pole of the heavens at any given date, past or future, and we find that the center of the unmapped space was the south pole of the heavens something like 4,600 years ago, that is to say about 2,700 B.C. It is, of course, not possible to fix either time or latitude very closely, since the limits of the unmapped space are a little vague. But it is significant that if we take a celestial globe, arranged so as to represent the heavens for the time 2700 B.C., and for north latitude 40 degrees, we find several striking relations. First of all, the Great Dragon then linked together the north pole of the celestial equator, and the north pole of the ecliptic. It was as nearly as possible symmetrical with regard to the two, it occupied the very crown of the heavens. With the single exception of the Little Bear, which it nearly surrounds, the Dragon was the only constellation that never set. Next, the Water Snake, see diagram, page 200, lay at this time right along the equator, extending over 105 degrees of right ascension, or, to put it less technically, it took 7 hours out of the 24 to cross the meridian. It covered nearly 1/3 of the equatorial belt. Thirdly, the intersection of the equator with one of the principal meridians of the sky was marked by the serpent, which is carried by the serpent holder in a very peculiar manner. The meridian at midnight at the time of the spring equinox is called a colure, the autumnal colure, because the sun crosses it in autumn. Now the serpent was so arranged as to be shown writhing itself for some distance along the equator, and then struggling upwards, along the autumnal colure, marking the zenith with its head. The lower part of the autumnal colure was marked by the scorpion, and the foot of the serpent holder pressed down the creature's head, just where the colure, the equator, and the ecliptic intersected, see diagram, page 164. It is scarcely conceivable that this fourfold arrangement, not suggested by any natural grouping of the stars, should have come about by accident. It must have been intentional. For some reason, the equator, the colure, the zenith and the poles were all marked out by these serpentine or draconic forms. The unmapped space gives us a clue only to the date and latitude of the designing of the most southerly constellations. We now see that a number of the northern hold positions which were specially significant under the same conditions, indicating that they were designed at about the same date. There is therefore little room for doubt that sometime in the earlier half of the 3rd millennium before our era, and somewhere between the 36th and 40th parallels of north latitude, the constellations were designed, substantially as we have them now, the serpent forms being intentionally placed in these positions of great astronomical importance. It will have been noticed that Ptolemy makes the Ram the first constellation of the zodiac. It was so in his days, but it was the bull that was the original leader, as we know from a variety of traditions, the sun at the spring equinox being in the center of that constellation about 3000 B.C. At the time when the constellations were designed, the sun at the spring equinox was near Aldebaran, the brightest star of the bull. At the summer solstice it was near Regulus, the brightest star of the lion. At the autumnal equinox it was near Antares, the brightest star of the scorpion. At the winter solstice it was near Fomalhaut, the brightest star in the neighborhood of the waterpourer. These 4 stars have come down to us with the name of the royal stars, probably because they were so near to the 4 most important points in the apparent path of the sun amongst the stars. There is also a celebrated passage in the first of Virgil's Georgics which speaks of the white bull with golden horns that opens the year. So when the Mithraic religion adopted several of the constellation figures amongst its symbols, the bull as standing for the spring equinox, the lion for the summer solstice, were the 2 to which most prominence was given, and they are found thus used in Mithraic monuments as late as the 2nd or 3rd century A.D., long after the ram had been recognized as the leading sign. It is not possible to push back the origin of the constellations to an indefinite antiquity. They cannot at the very outside be more than 5,000 years old, they must be considerably more than 4,000. But during the whole of this millennium the sun at the spring equinox was in the constellation of the bull. There is therefore no possible doubt that the bull, and not the twins nor the ram, was the original leader of the zodiac. The constellations, therefore, were designed long before the nation of Israel had its origin, indeed before Abraham left Ur of the Chaldees. The most probable date, 2700 BC, would take us to a point a little before the flood, if we accept the Hebrew chronology, a few centuries after the flood, if we accept the Septuagint chronology. Just as the next great age of astronomical activity, which I have termed the classical, began after the close of the canon of the Old Testament scriptures, so the constellation age began before the first books of those scriptures were compiled. Broadly speaking, it may be said that the knowledge of the constellation figures was the chief asset of astronomy in the centuries when the Old Testament was being written. Seeing that the knowledge of these figures was preserved in Mesopotamia, the country from which Abraham came out, and that they were in existence long before his day, it is not unreasonable to suppose that both he and his descendants were acquainted with them, and that when he and they looked upward to the glories of the silent stars, and recalled the promise, "So shall thy seed be," they pictured round those glittering points of light much the same forms that we connect with them today. Footnotes 157:1 Delitzsch is, therefore, in error when he asserts that, when we divide the zodiac into 12 signs and style them the ram, bull, twins, etc. The Sumerian-Babylonian culture is still living and operating even at the present day, Babel and Bible, page 67. The constellations may have been originally designed by the Akkadians, but if so it was before they came down from their native highlands into the Mesopotamian valley. Chapter 2 Genesis and the constellations. As we have just shown, the constellations evidently were designed long before the earliest books of the Old Testament received their present form. But the first 9 chapters of Genesis give the history of the world before any date that we can assign to the constellations, and are clearly derived from very early documents or traditions. When the constellations are compared with those 9 chapters, several correspondences appear between the two, remarkable, when it is borne in mind how few are the events that can be plainly set forth in a group of 48 figures on the one hand, and how condensed are the narratives of those 9 chapters on the other. Look at the 6 southern constellations, see pages 164, 165, which were seen during the nights of spring in that distant time. The largest of these 6 is a great ship resting on the southern horizon. Just above, a raven is perched on the stretched-out body of a reptile. A figure of a centaur appears to have just left the ship, and is represented as offering up an animal on an altar. The animal is now shown as a wolf, but Aratus, our earliest authority, states that he did not know what kind of animal it was that was being thus offered up. The cloud of smoke from the altar is represented by the bright coiling wreaths of the Milky Way, and here in the midst of that cloud is set the bow of Sagittarius, the archer. Is it possible that this can be mere coincidence, or was it indeed intended as a memorial of the covenant which God made with Noah, and with his children forever? I do set my bow in the cloud, and it shall be for a token of a covenant between me and the earth. Close by this group was another, made up of 5 constellations. Towards the south, near midnight in spring, the observer in those ancient times saw the scorpion. The figure of a man was standing upon that venomous beast, with his left foot pressed firmly down upon its head, but the scorpion's tail was curled up to sting him in the right heel. Ophiuchus, the serpent holder, the man treading on the scorpion, derives his name from the serpent which he holds in his hands and strangles, the serpent that, as we have seen in the preceding chapter, marked the autumnal colure. The head of Ophiuchus reached nearly to the zenith, and there close to it was the head of another hero, so close that to complete the form of the 2 heads the same stars must be used to some extent twice over. Facing north, this second hero, now known to us as Hercules, but to Aratus simply as the Kneeler, was seen kneeling with his foot on the head of the great northern dragon. This great conflict between the man and the serpent, therefore, was presented in a twofold form. Looking south there was the picture of Ophiuchus trampling on the scorpion and strangling the snake, yet wounded in the heel by the scorpion's sting. Looking north, the corresponding picture of the kneeling figure of Hercules treading down the dragon's head. Here there seems an evident reference to the word spoken by God to the serpent in the garden in Eden, "I will put enmity between thee and the woman, and between thy seed and her seed," it shall bruise thy head, and thou shalt bruise his heel. The Midnight Constellations of Spring, B.C. 2700. The Midnight Constellations of Spring, B.C. 2700. To list these two groups of star figures seem therefore to point to the two great promises made to mankind and recorded in the early chapters of Genesis, the promise of the deliverer, seed of the woman, should bruise the serpent's head, and the promise of the bow set in the cloud, the pledge that the world should not again be destroyed by a flood. The Midnight Constellations of Winter, B.C. 2700. The Midnight Constellations of Winter, B.C. 2700. To list one or two other constellations appear, less distinctly, to refer to the first of these two promises. The Virgin, the woman of the zodiac, carries in her hand a bright star, the ear of corn, the seed, whilst, immediately under her, the great water snake, Hydra, is drawn out at enormous length, going on its belly, not writhing upwards like the serpent, nor twined round the crown of the sky like the dragon. Yet again, the narrative in Genesis tells us that God drove out the man, i.e. Adam, and he placed at the east of the Garden of Eden the cherubim, and the flame of a sword which turned every way, to keep the way of the tree of life. No description is given of the form of the cherubim in that passage, but they are fully described by Ezekiel, who saw them in vision when he was by the river Chebar, as the likeness of four living creatures. The same beings were also seen in vision by St. John, and are described by him in the Apocalypse as four living creatures, Zoa. The first creature was like a lion, and the second creature like a calf, and the third creature had a face as of a man, and the fourth creature was like a flying eagle. Ezekiel gives a fuller and more complex description, but agreeing in its essential elements with that given by the Apostle, and, at the close of one of these descriptions, he adds, "This is the living creature that I saw under the God of Israel by the river of Chebar, and I knew that they were cherubim." No doubt because as a priest he had been familiar with the cherubic forms as they were embroidered upon the curtains of the temple, and carved upon its walls and doors. The same four forms were seen amongst the constellation figures, not placed at random amongst them, but as far as possible in the four most important positions in the sky. For the constellations were originally so designed that the sun at the time of the summer solstice was in the middle of the constellation Leo, the lion, at the time of the spring equinox in the middle of Taurus, the bull, and at the time of the winter solstice, in the middle of Aquarius, the man bearing the water pot. The fourth point, that held by the sun at the autumnal equinox, would appear to have been already assigned to the foot of the serpent holder as he crushes down the scorpion's head, but a flying eagle, Aquila, is placed as near the equinoctial point as seems to have been consistent with the ample space that it was desired to give to the emblems of the great conflict between the deliverer and the serpent. Thus, as in the vision of Ezekiel, so in the constellation figures, the lion, the ox, the man, and the eagle, stood as the upholders of the firmament, as the pillars of heaven. They looked down like watchers upon all creation, they seemed to guard the four quarters of the sky. If we accept an old Jewish tradition, the constellations may likewise give us some hint of an event recorded in the 10th chapter of Genesis. For it has been supposed that the great stellar giant Orion is none other than Nimrod, the mighty hunter before the Lord, and the founder of the Babylonian kingdom, identified by some Assyriologists with Merodach, the tutelary deity of Babylon, and by others with Gilgamesh, the tyrant of Erech, whose exploits have been preserved to us in the great epic now known by his name. Possibly both identifications may prove to be correct. More than 1/3 of the constellation figures thus appear to have a close connection with some of the chief incidents recorded in the first 10 chapters of Genesis as having taken place in the earliest ages of the world's history. If we include the hare and the two dogs as adjuncts of Orion, and the cup as well as the raven with Hydra, then no fewer than 22 out of the 48 are directly or indirectly so connected. But the constellation figures only deal with a very few isolated incidents, and these are necessarily such as lend themselves to graphic representation. The points in common with the Genesis narrative are indeed striking, but the points of independence are no less striking. The majority of the constellation figures do not appear to refer to any incidents in Genesis. The majority of the incidents in the Genesis narrative find no record in the sky. Even in the treatment of incidents common to both there are differences, which make it impossible to suppose that either was directly derived from the other. But it is clear that when the constellations were devised, that is to say, roughly speaking, about 2700 BC, the promise of the deliverer, the seed of the woman, who should bruise the serpent's head, was well known and highly valued, so highly valued that a large part of the sky was devoted to its commemoration and to that of the curse on the serpent. The story of the flood was also known, and especially the covenant made with those who were saved in the ark, that the world should not again be destroyed by water, the token of which covenant was the bow set in the cloud. The fourfold cherubic forms were known, the keepers of the way of the tree of life, the symbols of the presence of God, and they were set in the four parts of the heaven, marking it out as the tabernacle which he spreadeth abroad, for he dwelleth between the cherubim. Chapter 3 The story of the deluge. Beside the narrative of the flood given to us in Genesis, and the pictorial representation of it preserved in the star figures, we have deluge stories from many parts of the world. But in particular we have a very striking one from Babylonia. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, already alluded to, the 11th tablet is devoted to an interview between the hero and Pir-napishtim, the Babylonian Noah, who recounts to him how he and his family were saved at the time of the great flood. This Babylonian story of the deluge stands in quite a different relation from the Babylonian story of creation in its bearing on the account given in Genesis. As we have already seen, the stories of creation have practically nothing in common. The stories of the deluge have many most striking points of resemblance, and may reasonably be supposed to have had a common origin. Professor Friedrich Delitzsch, in his celebrated lectures Babel and Bible, refers to this Babylonian deluge story in the following terms: the Babylonians divided their history into two great periods, the one before, the other after the flood. Babylon was in quite a peculiar sense the land of deluges. The alluvial lowlands along the course of all great rivers discharging into the sea are, of course, exposed to terrible floods of a special kind, cyclones and tornadoes accompanied by earthquakes and tremendous downpours of rain. After referring to the great cyclone and tidal wave which wrecked the Sundarbans at the mouths of the Ganges in 1876, when 215,000 persons met their death by drowning, Professor Delitzsch goes on, it is the merit of the celebrated Viennese geologist, Eduard Suess, to have shown that there is an accurate description of such a cyclone, line for line, in the Babylonian deluge story. The whole story, precisely as it was written down, traveled to Canaan. But, owing to the new and entirely different local conditions, it was forgotten that the sea was the chief factor, and so we find in the Bible two accounts of the deluge, which are not only scientifically impossible, but, furthermore, mutually contradictory, the one assigning to it a duration of 365 days, the other of 40 plus 3x7 equals 61 days. Science is indebted to Jean Estruc, that strictly orthodox Catholic physician of Louis XIV. For recognizing that two fundamentally different accounts of a deluge have been worked up into a single story in the Bible. 171:1 The importance of the Babylonian deluge story does not rest in anything intrinsic to itself, for there are many deluge stories preserved by other nations quite as interesting and as well told. It derives its importance from its points of resemblance to the Genesis story, and from the deduction that some have drawn from these that it was the original of that story, or rather of the two stories, that we find imperfectly recombined in Genesis. The suggestion of Jean Estruc that two fundamentally different accounts of a deluge have been worked up into a single story in the Bible has been generally accepted by those who have followed him in the minute analysis of the literary structure of Holy Scripture, and the names of the priestly narrative and of the Jehovistic narrative have, for the sake of distinctness, been applied to them. The former is so called because the chapters in Exodus and the two following books, which treat with particular minuteness of the various ceremonial institutions of Israel, are considered to be by the same writer. The latter has received its name from the preference shown by the writer for the use, as the divine name, of the word Jehovah, so spelt when given in our English versions, but generally translated, the Lord. There is a very close accord between different authorities as to the way in which Genesis, chapters 6-9, should be allotted to these two sources. The following is Dr. Driver's arrangement: priestly narrative, Jehovistic narrative, chap, verse. Verse. Genesis 6. 9-22, Genesis 7. 1-5, 7. 6, 7-10. 11, 12. 13-16a, 16b. 17a, 17b. 18-21, 22-23. 24, 8. 2b, 3a. 8, 1-2a. 6-12, 3b, 5. 13b, 13a. 20-22, 14-19. 9, 1-17. The priestly narrative therefore tells us the cause of the flood, that is to say, the corruption of mankind, describes the dimensions of the ark, and instructs Noah to bring, of every living thing of all flesh, 2 of every sort shalt thou bring into the ark, to keep them alive with thee, they shall be male and female. It further supplies the dates of the chief occurrences during the flood, states that the waters prevailed above the tops of the mountains, that when the flood diminished the ark rested upon the mountains of Ararat, and gives the account of Noah and his family going forth from the ark, and of the covenant which God made with them, of which the token was to be the bow seen in the cloud. The most striking notes of the Jehovistic narrative are, the incident of the sending out of the raven and the dove, the account of Noah's sacrifice, and the distinction made between clean beasts and beasts that are not clean, the command to Noah being, of every clean beast thou shalt take to thee by 7s, the male and his female, and of beasts that are not clean by 2, the male and his female. The significant points of distinction between the two accounts are that the priestly writer gives the description of the ark, the flood prevailing above the mountains, the grounding on Mount Ararat, and the bow in the cloud. The Jehovistic gives the sending out of the raven and the dove, and the account of Noah's sacrifice, which involves the recognition of the distinction between the clean and unclean beasts and the more abundant provision of the former. He also lays emphasis on the Lord's smelling a sweet savor, and promising never again to smite everything living, for the imagination of man's heart is evil from his youth. The chief features of the Babylonian story of the deluge are as follows. The god Aed spoke to Pir-napishtim, the Babylonian Noah, destroy the house, build a ship, leave what thou hast, see to thy life. Destroy the hostel and save life. Take up the seed of life, all of it, into the midst of the ship. The ship which thou shalt make, even thou. Let its size be measured, let it agree as to its height and its length. The description of the building of the ship seems to have been very minute, but the record is mutilated, and what remains is difficult to translate. As in the priestly narrative, it is expressly mentioned that it was pitched within and without. The narrative proceeds in the words of Pir-napishtim, all I possessed, I collected it, all I possessed I collected it, of silver, all I possessed I collected it, of gold, all I possessed I collected it, the seed of life, the whole. I caused to go up into the midst of the ship, all my family and relatives, the beasts of the field, the animals of the field, the sons of the artificers, all of them I sent up. The god Samus appointed the time, Mur-kuki, in the night I will cause the heavens to rain destruction, enter into the midst of the ship, and shut thy door. That time approached, Mur-kuki, in the night the heavens rained destruction. I saw the appearance of the day, I was afraid to look upon the day, I entered into the midst of the ship, and shut my door at the appearance of dawn. In the morning, there arose from the foundation of heaven a dark cloud, the first day, the storm. Swiftly it swept, and like a battle against the people it sought. Brother saw not brother. The people were not to be recognized. In heaven the gods feared the flood, and they fled, they ascended to the heaven of Anu. The gods kenneled like dogs, crouched down in the enclosures. The gods had crouched down, seated in lamentation, covered were their lips in the assemblies. 6 days and nights the wind blew, the deluge and flood overwhelmed the land. The 7th day, when it came, the storm ceased, the raging flood, which had contended like a whirlwind, quieted, the sea shrank back, and the evil wind and deluge ended. I noticed the sea making a noise, and all mankind had turned to corruption. I noted the regions, the shore of the sea, for 12 measures the region arose. The ship had stopped at the land of Nizur. The mountain of Nizur seized the ship, and would not let it pass. The first day and the second day the mountains of Nizar seized the ship, and would not let it pass. The seventh day, when it came I sent forth a dove, and it left, the dove went, it turned about, but there was no resting place, and it returned. I sent forth a swallow, and it left, the swallow went, it turned about, but there was no resting place, and it returned. I sent forth a raven, and it left, the raven went, the rushing of the waters it saw, it ate, it waited, it croaked, it did not return. I sent forth, the animals, to the four winds, I poured out a libation, I made an offering on the peak of the mountain, 7 and 7 I set incense vases there, in their depths I poured cane, cedar, and rosewood. The gods smelled a savor, the gods smelled a sweet savor. The gods gathered like flies over the sacrificer. Then the goddess Sirtu, when she came, raised the great signets that Anu had made at her wish, these gods, by the lapis stone of my neck, let me not forget, these days let me remember, nor forget them forever. Let the gods come to the sacrifice, but let not Baal come to the sacrifice, for he did not take counsel, and made a flood, and consigned my people to destruction. Then Baal, when he came, saw the ship. And Baal stood still, filled with anger on account of the gods and the spirits of heaven. What, has a soul escaped? Let not a man be saved from the destruction. Ninip opened his mouth and spake. He said to the warrior Baal, who but Ae has done the thing? And Ae knows every event. Ae opened his mouth and spake, he said to the warrior Baal, thou sage of the gods, warrior, verily thou hast not taken counsel, and hast made a flood. The sinner has committed his sin, the evildoer has committed his misdeed, be merciful, let him not be cut off, yield, let not perish. Why hast thou made a flood? Let the lion come, and let men diminish. Why hast thou made a flood? Let the hyena come, and let men diminish. Why hast thou made a flood? Let a famine happen, and let the land be. Why hast thou made a flood? Let Ura, pestilence, come, and let the land be. 176:1, of the 4 records before us, we can only date one approximately. The constellations, as we have already seen, were mapped out sometime in the 3rd millennium before our era, probably not very far from 2700 BC. When was the Babylonian story written? Does it, itself, afford any evidence of date? It occurs in the 11th tablet of the Epic of Gilgamesh, and the theory has been started that as Aquarius, a watery constellation, is now the 11th sign of the zodiac, therefore we have in this epic of 12 tablets a series of solar myths founded upon the 12 signs of the zodiac, the 11th giving us a legend of a flood to correspond to the stream of water which the man in Aquarius pours from his pitcher. If this theory be accepted, we can date the Epic of Gilgamesh with much certainty. It must be later, probably much later, than 700 BC, for it cannot have been till about that time that the present arrangement of the zodiacal signs, that is to say with Aries as the first and Aquarius as the 11th, can have been adopted. We have then to allow for the growth of a mythology with the 12 signs as its motif. Had this supposed series of zodiacal myths originated before 700 BC, before Aries was adopted as the leading sign, then the bull, Taurus, would have given rise to the myth of the first tablet and Aquarius to the 10th, not to the 11th where we find the story of the flood. Assyriologists do not assign so late a date to this poem, and it must be noted that the theory supposes, not merely that the tablet itself, but that the poem and the series of myths upon which it was based, were all later in conception than 700 BC. One conclusive indication of its early date is given by the position in the pantheon of Ae and Baal. Ae has not receded into comparative insignificance, nor has Baal attained to that full supremacy which, as Merodach, he possesses in the Babylonian creation story. We may therefore put on one side as an unsupported and unfortunate guess the suggestion that the Epic of Gilgamesh is the setting forth of a series of zodiacal myths. Any legends, any mythology, any pantheon based upon the zodiac must necessarily be more recent than the zodiac. Any system involving Aries as the first sign of the zodiac must be later than the adoption of Aries as the first sign, that is to say, later than 700 BC, systems arising before that date would inevitably be based upon Taurus as first constellation. We cannot then, from astronomical relationships, fix the date of the Babylonian story of the flood. Is it possible, however, to form any estimate of the comparative ages of the Babylonian legend and of the two narratives given in Genesis, or of either of these two? Does the Babylonian story connect itself with one of the Genesis narratives rather than the other? The significant points in the Babylonian story are these: the command to pt.3 to build a ship, with detailed directions, the great rise of the flood so that even the gods in the heaven of Anu feared it, the detailed dating of the duration of the flood, the stranding of the ship on the mountain of Nizar, the sending forth of the dove, the swallow, and their return, the sending forth of the raven, and its non-return, the sacrifice, the god smelling its sweet savor, the vow of remembrance of the goddess by the lapis stone necklace, the determination of the gods not to send a flood again upon the earth, since sin is inevitable from the sinner. To all these points we find parallels in the account as given in Genesis. But it is in the priestly narrative that we find the directions for the building of the ship, the great prevalence of the flood even to the height of the mountains, the stranding of the ship on a mountain, and the bow in the clouds as a covenant of remembrance, this last being perhaps paralleled in the Babylonian story by the mottled, blue and white, lapis necklace of the goddess which she swore by as a remembrancer. There is therefore manifest connection with the narrative told by the priestly writer. But it is in the Jehovistic narrative, on the other hand, that we find the sending forth of the raven, and its non-return, the sending forth of the dove, and its return, the sacrifice, and the sweet savor that was smelled of the Lord, and the determination of the Lord not to curse the earth any more for man's sake, nor smite any more every living thing, for the imagination of man's heart is evil from his youth. There is, therefore, no less manifest connection with the narrative told by the Jehovistic writer. But the narrative told by the writer of the Babylonian story is one single account. Even if it were a combination of two separate traditions, they have been so completely fused that they cannot now be broken up so as to form two distinct narratives, each complete in itself. The whole story precisely as it was written down traveled to Canaan, so we are told. And there, we are asked to believe, two Hebrew writers of very different temperaments and schools of thought, each independently worked up a complete story of the deluge from this Gilgamesh legend. They chose out different incidents, one selecting what the other rejected, and vice versa, so that their two accounts were mutually contradictory. They agreed, however, in cleansing it from its polytheistic setting, and giving it a strictly monotheistic tone. Later, an editor put the two narratives together, with all their inconsistencies and contradictions, and interlocked them into one, which presents all the main features of the original Gilgamesh story except its polytheism. In other words, two Hebrew scribes each told in his own way a part of the account of the deluge which he had derived from Babylon, and a third unwittingly so recombined them as to make them represent the Babylonian original. The two accounts of the deluge, supposed to be present in Genesis, therefore cannot be derived from the Gilgamesh epic, nor be later than it, seeing that what is still plainly separable in Genesis is inseparably fused in the epic. On the other hand, can the Babylonian narrative be later than, and derived from, the Genesis account? Since so many of the same circumstances are represented in both, this is a more reasonable proposition, if we assume that the Babylonian narrator had the Genesis account as it now stands, and did not have to combine two separate statements. For surely if he had the separate priestly and Jehovistic narratives we should now be able to decompose the Babylonian narrative just as easily as we do the one in Genesis. The Babylonian adapter of the Genesis story must have either been less astute than ourselves, and did not perceive that he had really two distinct, and contradictory, narratives to deal with, or he did not consider this circumstance of the slightest importance, and had no objection to merging them inextricably into one continuous account. It is therefore possible that the Babylonian account was derived from that in Genesis, but it is not probable. The main circumstances are the same in both, but the details, the presentment, the attitude of mind are very different. We can better explain the agreement in the general circumstances, and even in many of the details, by presuming that both are accounts, genuine traditions, of the same actual occurrence. The differences in detail, presentment, and attitude, are fully and sufficiently explained by supposing that we have traditions from 2, if not 3, witnesses of the event. We have also the pictorial representation of the flood given us in the constellations. What evidence do they supply? Here the significant points are, the ship grounded upon a high rock, the raven above it, eating the flesh of a stretched-out reptile, a sacrifice offered up by a person, who has issued forth from the ship, upon an altar, whose smoke goes up in a cloud, in which a bow is set. In this grouping of pictures we have 2 characteristic features of the priestly narrative, in the ship grounded on a rock, and in the bow set in the cloud. We have also 2 characteristic features of the Jehovistic narrative, in the smoking altar of sacrifice, and in the carrion bird. There is therefore manifest connection between the constellation grouping and both the narratives given in Genesis. But the constellational picture story is the only one of all these narratives that we can date. It must have been designed, as we have seen, about 2700 BC. The question again comes up for answer. Were the Genesis and Babylonian narratives, any or all of them, derived from the pictured story in the constellations, or, on the other hand, was this derived from any or all of them? The constellations were mapped out near the north latitude of 40 degrees, far to the north of Babylonia, so the pictured story cannot have come from thence. We do not know where the Genesis narratives were written, but if the flood of the constellations was pictured from them, then they must have been already united into the account that is now presented to us in Genesis, very early in the 3rd millennium before Christ. Could the account in Genesis have been derived from the constellations? If it is a double account, most decidedly not, since the pictured story in the constellations is one, and presents impartially the characteristic features of both the narratives. And, as in comparing the Genesis and the Babylonian narratives, we see that though the main circumstances are the same, in so far as they lend themselves to pictorial representations, the details, the presentment, the attitude are different. In the Genesis narrative, the bow set in the cloud is a rainbow in a cloud of rain. In the constellation picture, the bow set in the cloud is the bow of an archer, and the cloud is the pillar of smoke from off the altar of sacrifice. In the narratives of Genesis and Babylonia, Noah and Pir-napishtim are men. No hint is given anywhere that by their physical form or constitution they were marked off from other men. In the storied picture, he who issues from the ship is a centaur, his upper part is the head and body of a man, his lower part is the body of a horse. As before, there is no doubt that we can best explain the agreement in circumstance of all the narratives by presuming that they are independent accounts of the same historical occurrence. We can, at the same time, explain the differences in style and detail between the narratives by presuming that the originals were by men of different qualities of mind who each wrote as the occurrence most appealed to him. The Babylonian narrator laid hold of the promise that, though beast, or famine, or pestilence might diminish men, a flood should not again sweep away every living thing, and connected the promise with the signets, the lapis necklace of the goddess Sertu that she touched as a remembrancer. The picture of the constellations saw the pledge in the smoke of the sacrifice, in the spirit of the words of the Lord as given by Asaph, "Gather my saints together unto me, those that have made a covenant with me by sacrifice." The writer in Genesis saw the promise in the rain cloud, for the rainbow can only appear with the shining of the sun. The writer in Genesis saw in Noah a righteous man, worthy to escape the flood of desolation that swept away the wickedness around. There is no explanation apparent, at least on the surface, as to why the designer of the constellations made him, who issued from the ship and offered the sacrifice, a centaur, one who partook of 2 natures. The comparison of the deluge narratives from Genesis, from the constellations, and from Babylonia, presents a clear issue. If all the accounts are independent, and if there are 2 accounts intermingled into one in Genesis, then the chief facts presented in both parts of that dual narrative must have been so intermingled at an earlier date than 2700 BC. The editor who first united the 2 stories into one must have done his work before that date. But if the accounts are not independent histories, and the narrative as we have it in Genesis is derived either in whole or in part from Babylonia or from the constellations, if, in short, the Genesis story came from a Babylonian or a stellar myth, then we cannot escape from this conclusion, that the narrative in Genesis is not, and never has been, two separable portions, that the scholars who have so divided it have been entirely in error. But we cannot so lightly put on one side the whole of the results which the learning and research of so many scholars have given us in the last century and a half. We must therefore unhesitatingly reject the theory that the Genesis deluge story owes anything either to star myth or to Babylonian mythology. And if the Genesis deluge story is not so derived, certainly no other portion of Holy Scripture. Footnotes 171:1, Babel and Bible, John's translation, pages 42 to 46. 176:1, T.G. Pinches, The Old Testament in the Light of the Historical Records of Assyria and Babylonia, pages 102 to 107. Chapter for the Tribes of Israel and the Zodiac. The earliest reference in Scripture to the constellations of the zodiac occurs in the course of the history of Joseph. In relating his second dream to his brethren he said, "Behold, I have dreamed a dream more, and, behold, the sun and the moon, and the 11 stars made obeisance to me." The word kochab in the Hebrew means both star and constellation. The significance, therefore, of the reference to the 11 stars is clear. Just as Joseph's 11 brethren were 11 out of the 12 sons of Jacob, so Joseph saw 11 constellations out of the 12 come and bow down to him. And the 12 constellations can only mean the 12 of the zodiac. There can be no reasonable doubt that the zodiac in question was practically the same as we have now, the one transmitted to us through Aratus and Ptolemy. It had been designed quite 1,000 years earlier than the days of Joseph. It was known in Mesopotamia from whence his ancestors had come, it was known in Egypt, that is to say it was known on both sides of Canaan. There have been other zodiacs, thus the Chinese have one of their own, but we have no evidence of any zodiac, except the one transmitted to us by the Greeks, as having been at any time adopted in Canaan or the neighboring countries. There is no need to suppose that each of the brethren had a zodiacal figure already assigned to him as a kind of armorial bearing or device. The dream was appropriate and perfectly intelligible to Jacob, to Joseph, and his brethren, without supposing that any such arrangement had then been made. It is quite true that there are Jewish traditions assigning a constellation to each of the tribes of Israel, but it does not appear that any such traditions can be distinctly traced to a great antiquity, and they are mostly somewhat indefinite. Josephus, for instance, makes a vague assertion about the 12 precious stones of the high priest's breastplate, each of which bore the name of one of the tribes, connecting them with the signs of the zodiac. Now the names of all those sons of Jacob were engraven in these stones, whom we esteem the heads of our tribes, each stone having the honor of a name, in the order according to which they were born. And for the 12 stones, whether we understand by them the months, or whether we understand the like number of the signs of that circle which the Greeks call the zodiac, we shall not be mistaken in their meaning. 187:1, But whilst there is no sufficient evidence that each of the sons of Jacob had a zodiacal figure for his coat of arms, nor even that the tribes deriving their names from them were so furnished, there is strong and harmonious tradition as to the character of the devices borne on the standards carried by the 4 divisions of the host in the march through the wilderness. The 4 divisions, or camps, each contained 3 tribes, and were known by the name of the principal tribe in each. The camp of Judah was on the east, and the division of Judah led on the march. The camp of Reuben was on the south. The camp of Ephraim was on the west. The camp of Dan was on the north, and the division of Dan brought up the rear. And the traditional devices shown on the 4 standards were these: for Judah, a lion; for Reuben, a man and a river; for Ephraim, a bull; for Dan, an eagle and a serpent. In these 4 standards we cannot fail to see again the 4 cherubic forms of lion, man, ox and eagle, but in 2 cases an addition was made to the cherubic form, an addition recalling the constellation figure. For just as the crest of Reuben was not a man only, but a man and a river, so Aquarius is not a man only, but a man pouring out a stream of water. And as the crest of Dan was not an eagle only, but an eagle and a serpent, so the great group of constellations, clustering round the autumnal equinox, included not only the eagle, but also the scorpion and the serpent. See diagram, page 189. There appears to be an obvious connection between these devices and the blessings pronounced by Jacob upon his sons, and by Moses upon the tribes. Indeed, it would seem probable that it was the former that largely determined the choice of the devices adopted by the four great divisions of the host in the wilderness. The blessing pronounced by Jacob on Judah runs, Judah is a lion's whelp, from the prey, my son, thou art gone up, he stooped down, he couched as a lion, and as an old lion, who shall rouse him up? The Lion of the tribe of Judah, is the title given to our Lord himself in the Apocalypse of St. John. Ophiuchus and the neighboring constellations. Ophiuchus and the neighboring constellations. To list the blessing pronounced upon Joseph by Moses bears as emphatic a reference to the bull. The firstling of his bullock, majesty is his, and his horns are the horns of the wild ox. Jacob's blessing upon Joseph does not show any reference to the ox or bull in our authorized version. But in our revised version Jacob says of Simeon and Levi, in their anger they slew a man, and in their self-will they houghed an ox. The first line appears to refer to the massacre of the Shechemites, the second is interpreted by the Jerusalem Targum, in their willfulness they sold Joseph their brother, who is likened to an ox. And in the blessing of Joseph it is said that his branches, margin, daughters, run over the wall. Some translators have rendered this, the daughters walk upon the bull, wall, and bull being only distinguishable in the original by a slight difference in the pointing. Of Reuben, his father said, unstable as water, thou shalt not excel, and of Dan, Dan shall be a serpent by the way, an adder in the path, that biteth the horse heels, so that his rider shall fall backward. These two last prophecies supply the water and the serpent, which, added to the man and eagle of the cherubic forms, are needed to complete the traditional standards, and are needed also to make them conform more closely to the constellation figures. No such correspondence can be traced between the 8 remaining tribes and the 8 remaining constellations. Different writers combine them in different ways, and the allusions to constellation figures in the blessings of those tribes are in most cases very doubtful and obscure, even if it can be supposed that any such allusions are present at all. The connection cannot be pushed safely beyond the 4 chief tribes, and the 4 cherubic forms as represented in the constellations of the 4 quarters of the sky. These 4 standards, or rather, 3 of them, meet us again in a very interesting connection. When Israel reached the borders of Moab, Balak, the king of Moab, sent for a seer of great reputation, Balaam, the son of Beor, to come, curse me Jacob, and come, defy Israel. Balaam came, but instead of cursing Jacob, blessed the people in 4 prophecies, wherein he made, what would appear to be, distinct references to the standards of Judah, Joseph and Reuben. Behold the people riseth up as a lioness, and as a lion doth he lift himself up. Then again, he couched, he lay down as a lion, and as a lioness, who shall rouse him up? And in 2 passages, God bringeth him forth out of Egypt, he hath as it were the strength of the wild ox. The wild ox and lion are obvious similes to use concerning a powerful and warlike people. These 2 similes are, therefore, not sufficient by themselves to prove that the tribal standards are being referred to. But the otherwise enigmatical verse, water shall flow from his buckets, appears more expressly as an allusion to the standard of Reuben, the man with the river, Aquarius pouring water from his pitcher, and if one be a reference to a standard, the others may also well be. Aquarius and the neighboring constellations. Aquarius and the neighboring constellations. To list it is surely something more than coincidence that Joseph, who by his father's favor and his own merit was made the leader of the 12 brethren, should be associated with the bull or wild ox, seeing that Taurus was the leader of the zodiac in those ages. It may also well be more than coincidence, that when Moses was in the mount and the people gathered themselves unto Aaron, and said unto him, Up, make us gods, which shall go before us, for as for this Moses, the man that brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we wot not what is become of him. Aaron fashioned the golden earrings given him into the form of a molten calf, into the similitude, that is to say, of Taurus, then prince of the zodiac. If we turn to St. Stephen's reference to this occurrence, we find that he says, And they made a calf in those days, and offered sacrifice unto the idol, and rejoiced in the works of their own hands. Then God turned, and gave them up to worship the host of heaven. In other words, their worship of the golden calf was star worship. It has been often pointed out that this sin of the Israelites, deep as it was not in itself a breach of the first commandment, "Thou shalt have no other gods before me." It was a breach of the second, "Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image, or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. Thou shalt not bow down thyself to them nor serve them." The Israelites did not conceive that they were abandoning the worship of Jehovah, they still considered themselves as worshipping the one true God. They were monotheists still, not polytheists. But they had taken the first false step that inevitably leads to polytheism. They had forgotten that they had seen no manner of similitude on the day that the Lord spake unto them in Horeb out of the midst of the fire, and they had worshipped this golden calf as the similitude of God. They had changed their glory into the similitude of an ox that eateth grass. And that was treason against him. Therefore St. Stephen said, God turned, and gave them up to worship the host of heaven. The one sin inevitably led to the other, indeed, involved it. In a later day, when Jeroboam, who had been appointed by Solomon ruler over all the charge of the house of Joseph, led the rebellion of the 10 tribes against Rehoboam, king of Judah, he set up golden calves at Dan and Bethel, and said unto his people, It is too much for you to go up to Jerusalem. Behold thy gods, O Israel, which brought thee up out of the land of Egypt. There can be little doubt that, in this case, Jeroboam was not so much recalling the transgression in the wilderness, it was not an encouraging precedent, as he was adopting the well-known cognizance of the tribe of Joseph, that is to say, of the 2 tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh, which together made up the more important part of his kingdom, as the symbol of the presence of Jehovah. The southern kingdom would naturally adopt the device of its predominant tribe, Judah, and it was as the undoubted cognizance of the kingdom of Judah that our Richard I, the Crusader, placed the lion on his shield. More definitely still, we find this one of the cherubic forms applied to set forth Christ himself, as, the root of David, prince of the house of Judah. Behold, the lion of the tribe of Judah, the root of David, hath prevailed to open the book, and to loose the 7 seals thereof. Footnotes 187:1, Josephus, Antiquities of the Jews, 3. 7, 5-7. Chapter V. Leviathan. There are amongst the constellations 4 great draconic or serpent-like forms. Chief of these is the great dragon coiled round the pole of the ecliptic and the pole of the equator, as the latter was observed some 4,600 years ago. This is the dragon with which the kneeler, Hercules, is fighting, and whose head he presses down with his foot. The second is the great water snake, Hydra, which 4,600 years ago stretched for 105 degrees along the celestial equator of that day. Its head was directed towards the ascending node, that is to say the point where the ecliptic, the sun's apparent path, crosses the equator at the spring equinox, and its tail stretched nearly to the descending node, the point where the ecliptic again meets the equator at the autumn equinox. The third was the serpent, the one held in the grip of the serpent holder. Its head erected itself just above the autumn equinox, and reached up as far as the zenith, its tail lay along the equator. The fourth of these draconic forms was the great sea monster, stretched out along the horizon, with a double river, Eridanus, proceeding from it, just below the spring equinox. Hercules and Draco. Hercules and Draco. To list none of these 4 figures was suggested by the natural grouping of the stars. Very few of the constellation figures were so suggested, and these 4 in particular, as so high an authority as Professor Schiaparelli expressly points out, were not amongst that few. Their positions show that they were designed some 4,600 years ago, and that they have not been materially altered down to the present time. Though no forms or semblances of forms are there in the heavens, yet we still seem to see, as we look upwards, not merely the stars themselves, but the same snakes and dragons, first imagined so many ages ago as coiling amongst them. The tradition of these serpentine forms and of their peculiar placing in the heavens was current among the Babylonians quite 1,500 years after the constellations were devised. For the little, boundary stones, often display, amongst many other astronomical symbols, the coiled dragon round the top of the stone, the extended snake at its base, see page 318, and at one or other corner the serpent bent into a right angle like that borne by the serpent holder, that is to say, the 3 out of the 4 serpentine forms that hold astronomically important positions in the sky. The positions held by these 3 serpents or dragons have given rise to a significant set of astronomical terms. The dragon marked the poles of both ecliptic and equator, the water snake marked the equator almost from node to node, the serpent marked the equator at one of the nodes. The dragon's head and the dragon's tail therefore have been taken as astronomical symbols of the ascending and descending nodes of the sun's apparent path, the points where he seems to ascend above the equator in the spring, and to descend below it again in the autumn. The moon's orbit likewise intersects the apparent path of the sun in 2 points, its 2 nodes, and the interval of time between its passage through one of these nodes and its return to that same node again is called a draconic month, a month of the dragon. The same symbols are applied by analogy to the moon's nodes. Indeed, the dragon's head is the general sign for the ascending node of any orbit, whether of moon, planet or comet, and the dragon's tail, for the descending node. We not only use these signs in astronomical works today, but the latter sign frequently occurs, figured exactly as we figure it now, on Babylonian boundary stones 3,000 years old. But an eclipse either of the sun or of the moon can only take place when the latter is near one of its 2 nodes, is in the dragon's head or in the dragon's tail. This relation might be briefly expressed by saying that the dragon, that is of the nodes, causes the eclipse. Hence the numerous myths, found in so many nations, which relate how a dragon devours the sun, or moon, at the time of an eclipse. Hydra and the neighboring constellations. Hydra and the neighboring constellations. To list the dragon of eclipse finds its way into Hindu mythology in a form which shows clearly that the myth arose from a misunderstanding of the constellations. The equatorial water snake, stretching from one node nearly to the other, has resting upon it, crater, the cup. Combining this with the expression for the 2 nodes, the Hindu myth has taken the following form. The gods churned the surface of the sea to make the Amrita cup, the cup of the water of life. And while the gods were drinking that nectar after which they had so much hankered, a Danava, named Rahu, was drinking it in the guise of a god. And when the nectar had only reached Rahu's throat, the sun and the moon discovered him, and communicated the fact to the gods. Rahu's head was at once cut off, but, as the nectar had reached thus far, it was immortal, and rose to the sky. From that time hath arisen a long-standing quarrel between Rahu's head and the sun and moon, and the head swallows them from time to time, causing eclipses. Rahu's head marks the ascending, Ketu, the tail, the descending node. This myth is very instructive. Before it could have arisen, not only must the constellations have been mapped out, and the equator and ecliptic both recognized, but the inclination of the moon's orbit to that of the sun must also have been recognized, together with the fact that it was only when the moon was near its node that the eclipses, either of the sun or moon, could take place. In other words, the cause of eclipses must have been at one time understood, but that knowledge must have been afterwards lost. We have seen already, in the chapter on the deep, that the Hebrew idea of Tiham could not possibly have been derived from the Babylonian myth of Tiamat, since the knowledge of the natural object must precede the myth founded upon it. If, therefore, Gen-I and the Babylonian story of creation be connected, the one as original, the other as derived from that original, it is the Babylonian story that has been borrowed from the Hebrew, and it has been degraded in the borrowing. So in this case, the myth of the dragon, whose head and tail cause eclipses, must have been derived from a corruption and misunderstanding of a very early astronomical achievement. The myth is evidence of knowledge lost, of science on the downgrade. Some may object that the myth may have brought about the conception of the draconic constellations. A very little reflection will show that such a thing was impossible. If the superstition that an eclipse is caused by an invisible dragon swallowing the sun or moon had really been the origin of the constellational dragons, they would certainly have all been put in the zodiac, the only region of the sky where sun or moon can be found, not outside it, where neither can ever come, and in consequence where no eclipse can take place. Nor could such a superstition have led on to the discoveries above mentioned, that the moon caused eclipses of the sun, the earth those of the moon, that the moon's orbit was inclined to the ecliptic, and that eclipses took place only near the nodes. The idea of an unseen spiritual agent being at work would prevent any search for a physical explanation, since polytheism is necessarily opposed to science. There is a word used in Scripture to denote a reptilian monster, which appears in one instance at least to refer to this dragon of eclipse, and so to be used in an astronomical sense. Job, in his first outburst of grief, cursed the day in which he was born, and cried, "Let them curse it that curse the day, who are ready, skillful, to rouse up Leviathan. Let the stars of the twilight thereof be dark, let it look for light, but have none, neither let it behold the eyelids of the morning." Leviathan denotes an animal wreathed, gathering itself in coils, hence a serpent, or some great reptile. The description in Job's lie is evidently that of a mighty crocodile, though in Psalms Siv Leviathan is said to play in the great and wide sea, which has raised a difficulty as to its identification in the minds of some commentators. In the present passage it is supposed to mean one of the stellar dragons, and hence the mythical dragon of eclipse. Job desired that the day of his birth should have been cursed by the magicians, so that it had been a day of complete and entire eclipse, not even the stars that preceded its dawn being allowed to shine. The astronomical use of the word Leviathan here renders it possible that there may be in Isa 27. An allusion, quite secondary and indirect however, to the chief stellar dragons. In that day the Lord with his sore and great and strong sword shall punish Leviathan the piercing serpent, even Leviathan that crooked serpent, and he shall slay the dragon that is in the sea. The marginal reading gives us instead of piercing, crossing like a bar, a most descriptive epithet for the long drawn-out constellation of Hydra, the water snake, which stretched itself for 105 degrees along the primitive equator, and crossed the meridian like a bar for 7 hours out of every 24. The crooked serpent would denote the dragon coiled around the poles, whilst the dragon which is in the sea would naturally refer to Cetus, the sea monster. The prophecy would mean then, that, in that day, the Lord will destroy all the powers of evil which have, as it were, laid hold of the chief places, even in the heavens. In one passage, the crooked serpent, here used as a synonym of Leviathan, distinctly points to the dragon of the constellations. In Job's last answer to Bildad the Shuhite, he says, "He divideth the sea with his power, and by his understanding he smitteth through the proud." R.V. Rahab. By his spirit he hath garnished the heavens, his hand hath formed the crooked serpent. The passage gives a good example of the parallelism of Hebrew poetry, the repetition of the several terms of a statement, term by term, in a slightly modified sense, or rhyme, if the expression may be used, not of sound, but of signification. Thus in the 4 verses just quoted, we have 3 terms in each: agent, action, object. Each appears in the first statement, each appears likewise in the second. The third statement, in like manner, has its 3 terms repeated in a varied form in the fourth. Thus, his power equals his understanding. Divideth equals smitteth through. The sea equals Rahab, the proud. And, his spirit equals his hand. Hath garnished equals hath formed. The heavens equals the crooked serpent. There can be no doubt as to the significance of the 2 parallels. In the first, dividing the sea, i.e. the Red Sea, is the correlative of smiting through Rahab, the proud one, the name often applied to Egypt, as in Isa XXX. 7. For Egypt helpeth in vain, and to no purpose, therefore have I called her Rahab that sitteth still. In the second, adorning the heavens, is the correlative of forming the crooked serpent. The great constellation of the writhing dragon, emphatically a crooked serpent, placed at the very crown of the heavens, is set for all the constellations of the sky. There are several references to Rahab, as the dragon which is in the sea, all clearly referring to the kingdom of Egypt, personified as one of her own crocodiles lying in wait in her own river, the Nile, or transferred, by a figure of speech, to the Red Sea, which formed her eastern border. Thus in chapter Lee Isaiah apostrophizes the arm of the Lord. Art thou not it that cut Rahab in pieces, that pierced the dragon? Art thou not it that dried up the sea, the waters of the great deep, that made the depths of the sea a way for the redeemed to pass over? And in Psalm 89. We have, Thou rulest the raging of the sea, when the waves thereof arise thou stillest them. Thou hast broken Rahab in pieces as one that is slain, thou hast scattered thine enemies with thy strong arm. So the prophet Ezekiel is directed, Son of man, take up a lamentation for Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and say unto him, Thou wast likened unto a young lion of the nations, yet art thou as a dragon in the seas. In all these passages it is only in an indirect and secondary sense that we can see any constellational references in the various descriptions of the dragon that is in the sea. It is the crocodile of Egypt that is intended, Egypt the great oppressor of Israel, and one of the great powers of evil, standing as a representative of them all. The serpent or dragon forms in the constellations also represented the powers of evil, especially the great enemy of God and man, the dragon, that old serpent, which is the devil, and Satan. So there is some amount of appropriateness to the watery dragons of the sky, Hydra and Cetus, in these descriptions of Rahab, the dragon of Egypt, without there being any direct reference. Thus it is said of the Egyptian dragon in the seas, I have given thee for meat to the beasts of the earth, and to the fowls of the heaven, and again, I will cause all the fowls of the heaven to settle upon thee, just as Corvus, the raven, is shown as having settled upon Hydra, the water snake, and is devouring its flesh. Again, Pharaoh, the Egyptian dragon, says, My river is mine own, and I have made it for myself, just as Cetus, the sea monster, is represented as pouring forth Eridanus, the river, from its mouth. Andromeda and Cetus. Andromeda and Cetus. To list but a clear and direct allusion to this last grouping of the constellations occurs in the Apocalypse. In the 12th chapter, the proud oppressor dragon from the sea is shown us again with much fullness of detail. There the apostle describes his vision of a woman, who evidently represents the people of God, being persecuted by a dragon. There is still a reminiscence of the deliverance of Israel in the Exodus from Egypt, for the woman fled into the wilderness, where she hath a place prepared of God, that there they may nourish her 1,260 days. And the vision goes on, and the serpent cast out of his mouth, after the woman water as a river, that he might cause her to be carried away by the stream. And the earth helped the woman, and the earth opened her mouth, and swallowed up the river which the dragon cast out of his mouth. This appears to be precisely the action which is presented to us in the three constellations of Andromeda, Cetus, and Eridanus. Andromeda is always shown as a woman in distress, and the sea monster, though placed far from her in the sky, has always been understood to be her persecutor. Thus Aratus writes, Andromeda, though far away she flies, dreads the sea monster, low in southern skies. The latter, baffled in his pursuit of his victim, has cast the river, Eridanus, out of his mouth, which, flowing down below the southern horizon, is apparently swallowed up by the earth. It need occasion no surprise that we should find imagery used by St. John in his prophecy already set forth in the constellations nearly 3,000 years before he wrote. Just as, in this same book, St. John repeated Daniel's vision of the fourth beast and Ezekiel's vision of the living creatures, as he used the well-known details of the Jewish temple, the candlesticks, the laver, the altar of incense, so he used a group of stellar figures perfectly well known at the time when he wrote. In so doing the beloved disciple only followed the example which his master had already set him. For the imagery in the parables of our Lord is always drawn from scenes and objects known and familiar to all men. In two instances in which Leviathan is mentioned, a further expression is used which has a distinct astronomical bearing. In the passage already quoted, where Job curses the day of his birth, he desires that it may not behold the eyelids of the morning. And in the grand description of Leviathan, the crocodile, in chapter 41. We have, his neesings flash forth light, and his eyes are like the eyelids of the morning. Canon Driver considers this as an allusion, probably to the reddish eyes of the crocodile, which are said to appear gleaming through the water before the head comes to the surface. This is because of the position of the eyes on the animal's head, not because they have any peculiar brilliancy. It is an idea exclusively Egyptian, and is another link in the chain of evidence which connects the author of the poem with Egypt. The crocodile's head is so formed that its highest points are the eyes, and when it rises obliquely to the surface the eyes are the first part of the whole animal to emerge. The Egyptians observing this, compared it to the sun rising out of the sea, and made it the hieroglyphic representative of the idea of sunrise. Thus Horace Apollo says, when the Egyptians represent the sunrise, they paint the eye of the crocodile, because it is first seen as that animal emerges from the water. 209:1, in this likening of the eyes of the crocodile to the eyelids of the morning, we have the comparison of one natural object with another. Such comparison, when used in one way and for one purpose, is the essence of poetry, when used in another way and for another purpose, is the essence of science. Both poetry and science are opposed to myth, which is the confusion of natural with imaginary objects, the mistaking the one for the other. Thus it is poetry when the psalmist speaks of the sun as a bridegroom coming out of his chamber, for there is no confusion in his thought between the two natural objects. The sun is like the bridegroom in the glory of his appearance. The psalmist does not ascribe to him a bride and children. It is science when the astronomer compares the spectrum of the sun with the spectra of various metals in the laboratory. He is comparing natural object with natural object, and is enabled to draw conclusions as to the elements composing the sun, and the condition in which they there exist. But it is myth when the Babylonian represents Bel or Merodach as the solar deity, destroying Tiamat, the dragon of darkness, for there is confusion in the thought. The imaginary god is sometimes given solar, sometimes human, sometimes superhuman characteristics. There is no actuality in much of what is asserted as to the sun or as to the holy imaginary being associated with it. The mocking words of Elijah to the priests of Baal were justified by the intellectual confusion of their ideas, as well as by the spiritual degradation of their idolatry. Cry aloud, for he is a god, either he is talking, or he is pursuing, or he is in a journey, or peradventure he sleepeth, and must be awakened. Such nature myths are not indications of the healthy mental development of a primitive people, they are the clear signs of a pathological condition, the symptoms of intellectual disease. It is well to bear in mind this distinction, this opposition between poetry and myth, for ignoring it has led to not a little misconception as to the occurrence of myth in Scripture, especially in connection with the names associated with the crocodile. Thus it has been broadly asserted that the original mythical signification of the monsters Tihum, Leviathan, Tannim, Rahab, is unmistakably evident. Of these names the first signifies the world of waters, the second and third real aquatic animals, and the last, the proud one, is simply an epithet of Egypt, applied to the crocodile as the representation of the kingdom. There is no more myth in setting forth Egypt by the crocodile or Leviathan than in setting forth Great Britain by the lion, or Russia by the bear. The Hebrews in setting forth their enemies by crocodile and other ferocious reptiles were not describing any imaginary monsters of the primeval chaos, but real oppressors. The Egyptian with his house of bondage, the Assyrian, which smote with a rod, the Chaldean who made havoc of Israel altogether, were not dreams. And in beseeching God to deliver them from their latest oppressor the Hebrews naturally recalled, not some idle tale of the fabulous achievements of Babylonian deities, but the actual deliverance God had wrought for them at the Red Sea. There the Egyptian crocodile had been made meat to the people inhabiting the wilderness, when the corpses of Pharaoh's bodyguard, cast up on the shore, supplied the children of Israel with the weapons and armor of which they stood in need. So in the day of their utter distress they could still cry in faith and hope, "Yet God is my King of old, working salvation in the midst of the earth. Thou didst divide the sea by thy strength, thou breakest the heads of the dragons in the waters. Thou breakest the heads of Leviathan in pieces, and gavest him to be meat to the people inhabiting the wilderness. Thou didst cleave the fountain and the flood, thou driedst up mighty rivers. The day is thine, the night also is thine, thou hast prepared the light and the sun. Thou hast set all the borders of the earth, thou hast made summer and winter." Footnotes: 209:1, P.H. Goss, in the Imperial Bible Dictionary. Chapter 6. The Pleiades. The translators of the Bible, from time to time, find themselves in a difficulty as to the correct rendering of certain words in the original. This is especially the case with the names of plants and animals. Some sort of clue may be given by the context, as, for instance, if the region is mentioned in which a certain plant is found, or the use that is made of it, or, in the case of an animal, whether it is clean or unclean, what are its habits, and with what other animals it is associated. But in the case of the few scripture references to special groups of stars, we have no such help. We are in the position in which Macaulay's New Zealander might be, if, long after the English nation had been dispersed, and its language had ceased to be spoken amongst men, he were to find a book in which the rivers Thames, Trent, Tyne, and Tweed were mentioned by name, but without the slightest indication of their locality. His attempt to fit these names to particular rivers would be little more than a guess the accuracy of which he would have no means for testing. This is somewhat our position with regard to the four Hebrew names, Kema, Kezel, Aish, and Maseroth, yet in each case there are some slight indications which have given a clue to the compilers of our Revised Version, and have, in all probability, guided them correctly. The constellations are not all equally attractive. A few have drawn the attention of all men, however otherwise inattentive. North American Indians and Australian savages have equally noted the flashing brilliancy of Orion, and the compact little swarm of the Pleiades. All northern nations recognize the 7 bright stars of the Great Bear, and they are known by a score of familiar names. They are the plough, or Charles's wain, of northern Europe, the 7 plough oxen of ancient Rome, the bier and mourners of the Arabs, the chariot or wagon of the old Chaldeans, the Big Dipper of the prosaic New England farmer. These 3 groups are just the 3 which we find mentioned in the earliest poetry of Greece. So Homer writes, in the 5th book of the Odyssey, that Ulysses, there viewed the Pleiades, and the northern team, and great Orion's more refulgent beam, to which, around the axle of the sky, the bear, revolving, points his golden eye. It seems natural to conclude that these constellations, the most striking, or at all events the most universally recognized, would be those mentioned in the Bible. The passages in which the Hebrew word Kema is used are the following: God, maketh Arcturus, Orion, and Pleiades, Kema, and the chambers of the south, Job 9. 9. Canst thou bind the sweet influences of Pleiades, Kema, or loose the bands of Orion? Job 38. 31. Seek him that mocketh the 7 stars, Kema, and Orion, Amos v. 8. In our Revised Version, Kema is rendered Pleiades in all 3 instances, and of course the translators of the Authorized Version meant the same group by the 7 stars in their free rendering of the passage from Amos. The word Kema signifies a heap, or a cluster, and would seem to be related to the Assyrian word kimtu, family, from a root meaning to tie, or bind, a family being a number of persons bound together by the very closest tie of relationship. If this be so, we can have no doubt that our translators have rightly rendered the word. There is one cluster in the sky, and one alone, which appeals to the unaided sight as being distinctly and unmistakably a family of stars, the Pleiades. The names Ash, or Aish, Kezel, and Kema are peculiar to the Hebrews, and are not, so far as we have any evidence at present, allied to names in use for any constellation amongst the Babylonians and Assyrians. They have, as yet, not been found on any cuneiform inscription. Amos, the herdsman of Tekoa, living in the 8th century B.C., 2 centuries before the Jews were carried into exile to Babylon, evidently knew well what the term signified, and the writer of the book of Job was no less aware of their signification. But the 70, who translated the Hebrew scriptures into Greek, were not at all clear as to the identification of these names of constellations, though they made their translation only 2 or 3 centuries after the Jews returned to Jerusalem under Ezra and Nehemiah, when oral tradition should have still supplied the meaning of such astronomical terms. Had these names been then known in Babylon, they could not have been unknown to the learned men of Alexandria in the 2nd century before our era, since at that time there was a very direct scientific influence of the one city upon the other. This Hebrew astronomy was so far from being due to Babylonian influence and teaching, that, though known centuries before the exile, after the exile we find the knowledge of its technical terms was lost. On the other hand, Kema was the term used in all Syriac literature to denominate the Pleiades, and we accordingly find in the Peshitta, the ancient Syriac version of the Bible, made about the 2nd century A.D., the term Kema retained throughout, but Kezel and Aish were reduced to their supposed Syriac equivalents. Whatever uncertainty was felt as to the meaning of Kema by the early translators, it is not now seriously disputed that the Pleiades is the group of stars in question. The word Kema means, as we have seen, cluster, or heap, so also the word Pleiades, which we use today, is probably derived from the Greek pleions, many. Several Greek poets, Athenaeus, Hesiod, Pindar, and Simonides, wrote the word Pleiades, i.e., rock pigeons, considered as flying from the hunter Orion. Others made them the 7 doves who carried ambrosia to the infant Zeus. Darcy Thompson says, the Pleiad is in many languages associated with bird names. And I am inclined to take the bird on the bull's back in coins of Eretria, Dikeia, and Thurii for the associated constellation of the Pleiad, 217:1, the Pleiades being situated on the shoulder of Taurus the bull. The Hyades were situated on the head of the bull, and in the Euphrates region these two little groups of stars were termed together, Mastabia Galgala, the great twins of the ecliptic, as Castor and Pollux were the twins of the zodiac. In one tablet, Imanabai, the sevenfold one, and Gutdua, the bull in front, are mentioned side by side, thus agreeing well with their interpretation of Pleiades and Hyades. The Semitic name for the Pleiades was also Temenu, and these groups of stars, worshipped as gods by the Babylonians, may possibly have been the Gad and Meni, that troop, and that number, referred to by the prophet Isaiah, LXV. 11. On many Babylonian cylinder seals there are engraved 7 small discs, in addition to other astronomical symbols. These 7 small stellar discs are almost invariably arranged in the form, or, much as we should nowadays plot the cluster of the Pleiades when mapping on a small scale the constellations round the bull. It is evident that these 7 little stellar discs do not mean the 7 planets, for in many cases the astronomical symbols which accompany them include both those of the sun and moon. It is most probable that they signify the Pleiades, or perhaps alternatively the Hyades. Possibly, reference is made to the worship of the Pleiades when the king of Assyria, in the 7th century B.C., brought men from Babylon and other regions to inhabit the depopulated cities of Samaria, and the men of Babylon made Sukkot-Benoth. The rabbis are said to have rendered this by the booths of the maidens, or the tents of the daughters, the Pleiades being the maidens in question. Generally they are the 7 sisters. Hesiod calls them the 7 virgins, and the virgin stars. The names given to the individual stars are those of the 7 daughters of Atlas and Pleione, thus Milton terms them the 7 Atlantic sisters. As we have seen, page 189, the device associated expressly with Joseph is the bull, and Jacob's blessing to his son has been sometimes rendered, Joseph is a fruitful bough, even a fruitful bough by a well, the daughters walk upon the bull. That is, the 7 sisters, the Pleiades, are on the shoulder of Taurus. Aratus wrote of the number of the Pleiades, 7 paths aloft men say they take, yet 6 alone are viewed by mortal eyes. From Zeus' abode no star unknown is lost, since first from birth we heard, but thus the tale is told. Stars of the Pleiades. Stars of the Pleiades. To list Euripides speaks of these 7 paths, and Eratosthenes calls them the 7-starred Pleiad, although he describes one as all invisible. There is a surprisingly universal tradition that they were 7 who now are 6. We find it not only in ancient Greece and Italy, but also among the black fellows of Australia, the Malays of Borneo, and the Negroes of the Gold Coast. There must be some reason to account for this widespread tradition. Some of the stars are known to be slightly variable, and one of the fainter stars in the cluster may have shone more brightly in olden time. The gaseous spectrum of Pleione renders it credible that this star may once have had great brilliancy. Alcyone, now the brightest star in the cluster, was not mentioned by Ptolemy among the 4 brightest Pleiads of his day. The 6 now visible to ordinary sight are Alcyone, Electra, Atlas, Maia, Merope and Taygetus. Seleno is the next in brightness, and the present candidate for the 7th place. By good sight, several more may be made out, thus Maestlin, the tutor of Kepler, mapped 11 before the invention of the telescope, and in our own day Carrington and Denning have counted 14 with the naked eye. In clear mountain atmosphere more than 7 would be seen by any keen-sighted observer. Usually 6 stars may be made out with the naked eye in both the Pleiades and the Hyades, or, if more than 6, then several more, though with both groups the number of 7 has always been associated. In the New Testament we find the 7 stars also mentioned. In the first chapter of the Revelation, the Apostle St. John says that he saw 7 golden candlesticks, and in the midst of the 7 candlesticks one like unto the Son of Man. And he had in his right hand 7 stars. Later in the same chapter it is explained that the 7 stars are the angels of the 7 churches, and the 7 candlesticks which thou sawest are the 7 churches. The 7 stars in a single compact cluster thus stand for the Church in its many diversities and its essential unity. This beautiful little constellation has become associated with a foolish fable. When it was first found that not only did the planets move round the Sun in orbits, but that the Sun itself also was traveling rapidly through space, a German astronomer, Madler, hazarded the suggestion that the center of the Sun's motion lay in the Pleiades. It was soon evident that there was no sufficient ground for this suggestion, and that many clearly established facts were inconsistent with it. Nevertheless, the idea caught hold of the popular mind, and it has acquired an amazing vogue. Non-astronomical writers have asserted that Alcyone, the brightest Pleiad, is the center of the entire universe. Some have even been sufficiently irreverent to declare that it is the seat of heaven, the throne of God. A popular London divine, having noticed a bright ring round Alcyone on a photograph of the group, took that halo, which every photographer would at once recognize as a mere photographic defect, as a confirmation of this baseless fancy. Foolishness of this kind has nothing to support it in science or religion, it is an offense against both. We have no reason to regard the Pleiades as the center of the universe, or as containing the attracting mass which draws our Sun forward in its vast mysterious orbit. R. H. Allen, in his survey of the literature of the Pleiades, mentions that Drach surmised that their midnight culmination in the time of Moses, 10 days after the autumnal equinox, may have fixed the Day of Atonement on the 10th of Tishri. 221:1, this is worth quoting as a sample of the unhappy astronomical guesses of commentators. Drach overlooked that his suggestion necessitated the assumption that in the time of Moses astronomers had already learned, first, to determine the actual equinox, next, to observe the culmination of stars on the meridian rather than their risings and settings, and, third and more important, to determine midnight by some artificial measurement of time. None of these can have been primitive operations. We have no knowledge that any of the 3 were in use in the time of Moses, certainly they were not suitable for a people on the march, like the Israelites in the wilderness. Above all, Drach ignored in this suggestion the fact that the Jewish calendar was a lunar-solar one, and hence that the 10th day of the 7th month could not bear any fixed relation either to the autumnal equinox, or to the midnight culmination of the Pleiades, any more than our Easter Sunday is fixed to the spring equinox on March 22. The Pleiades were often associated with the late autumn, as Aratus writes, men mark them rising with soul's setting light, forerunners of the winter's gloomy night. This is what is technically known as the achronical rising of the Pleiades, their rising at sunset, in contrast to their heliacal rising, their rising just before daybreak, which ushered in the springtime. This achronical rising has led to the association of the group with the rainy season, and with floods. Thus Statius called the cluster Pleiadum Novosum Sidus, and Valerius Flaccus distinctly used the word Pleiada for the showers. Josephus says that during the siege of Jerusalem by Antiochus Epiphanes in 170 B.C., the besieged wanted for water until relieved by a large shower of rain which fell at the setting of the Pleiades. R. H. Allen, in his Star Names and Their Meanings, states that the Pleiades are intimately connected with traditions of the flood found among so many and widely separated nations, and especially in the deluge myth of Chaldea, but he does not cite authorities or instances. The Talmud gives a curious legend connecting the Pleiades with the flood, when the Holy One, blessed be he, wished to bring the deluge upon the world. He took 2 stars out of Pleiades, and thus let the deluge loose. And when he wished to arrest it, he took 2 stars out of Arcturus and stopped it. 2:23:1. It would seem from this that the rabbis connected the number of visible stars with the number of the family in the ark, with the few, that is, 8 souls saved by water, of whom St. Peter speaks. 6 Pleiades only are usually seen by the naked eye. Traditionally 7 were seen, but the rabbis assumed that 2, not 1, were lost. Perhaps we may trace a reference to this supposed association of Chema with the flood in the passage from Amos already quoted, "Seek him that mocketh the 7 stars and Orion, that calleth for the waters of the sea, and poureth them out upon the face of the earth, the Lord is his name." Many ancient nations have set apart days in the late autumn in honor of the dead, no doubt because the year was then considered as dead. This season being marked by the achronical rising of the Pleiades, that group has become associated with such observances. There is, however, no reference to any custom of this kind in Scripture. What is the meaning of the inquiry addressed to Job by the Almighty? Canst thou bind the sweet influences of Pleiades? What was the meaning which it possessed in the thought of the writer of the book? What was the meaning which we should now put on such an inquiry, looking at the constellations from the standpoint which the researches of modern astronomy have given us? The first meaning of the text would appear to be connected with the apparent movement of the sun amongst the stars in the course of the year. We cannot see the stars by daylight, or see directly where the sun is situated with respect to them, but, in very early times, men learnt to associate the seasons of the year with the stars which were last seen in the morning, above the place where the sun was about to rise, in the technical term once in use, with the heliacal risings of stars. When the constellations were first designed, the Pleiades rose heliacally at the beginning of April, and were the sign of the return of spring. Thus Aratus, in his constellation poem writes, "Men mark them, i.e. the Pleiades, rising with the solar ray, the harbinger of summer's brighter day. They heralded, therefore, the revival of nature from her winter sleep, the time of which the kingly poet sang so alluringly, for, lo, the winter is past, the rain is over and gone, the flowers appear on the earth, the time of the singing of birds is come, and the voice of the turtle is heard in our land, the fig tree ripeneth her green figs, and the vines are in blossom, they give forth their fragrance." The constellation which thus heralded the return of this genial season was poetically taken as representing the power and influence of spring. Their sweet influences were those that had rolled away the gravestone of snow and ice which had lain upon the winter tomb of nature. Theirs was the power that brought the flowers up from under the turf, Earth's constellations of 1,000,000 varied stars to shine upwards in answer to the constellations of heaven above. Their influences filled copse and wood with the songs of happy birds. Theirs stirred anew the sap in the veins of the trees, and drew forth their reawakened strength in bud and blossom. Theirs was the bleating of the newborn lambs, theirs the murmur of the reviving bees. Upon this view, then, the question to Job was, in effect, what control hast thou over the powers of nature? Canst thou hold back the sun from shining in spring time, from quickening flower, and herb, and tree with its gracious warmth? This is God's work, year by year over 1,000 lands, on 1,000,000 hills, in 1,000,000 valleys. What canst thou do to hinder it? The question was a striking one which must have appealed to the patriarch, evidently a keen observer and lover of nature, and it was entirely in line with the other inquiries addressed to him in the same chapter. Where wast thou when I laid the foundations of the earth? The Revised Version renders the question, canst thou bind the cluster of the Pleiades, reading the Hebrew word ma'anadoth, instead of ma'adanath, following in this all the most ancient versions. On this view, Job is, in effect, asked, canst thou gather together the stars in the family of the Pleiades and keep them in their places? The expression of a chain or band is one suggested by the appearance of the group to the eye, but it is no less appropriate in the knowledge which photography and great telescopes have given us. To quote from Miss Clerk's description of the nebula discovered round the brighter stars of the Pleiades, Alcyone, Asterope, Seleno, Electra, Maia, Merope and Teegida, besides the Maia vortex, the Paris photographs depicted a series of nebulous bars on either side of Merope, and a curious streak extending like a fingerpost from Electra towards Alcyone. Streamers and fleecy masses of cosmical fog seem almost to fill the spaces between the stars, as clouds choke a mountain valley. The chief points of its concentration are the four stars Alcyone, Merope, Maia, and Electra, but it includes as well Seleno and Teegida, and is traceable southward from Asterope over an arc of 1 degree 10. The greater part of the constellation is shown as veiled in nebulous matter of most unequal densities. In some places it lies in heavy folds and wreaths, in others it barely qualifies the darkness of the sky ground. The details of its distribution come out with remarkable clearness, and are evidently to a large extent prescribed by the relative situations of the stars. Their lines of junction are frequently marked by nebulous rays, establishing between them, no doubt, relations of great physical importance, and masses of nebula, in numerous instances, seem as if pulled out of shape and drawn into festoons by the attractions of neighboring stars. But the strangest exemplification of this filamentous tendency is in a fine, thread-like process, 3 or 4 wide, but 35 to 40 long, issuing in an easterly direction from the edge of the nebula about Maia, and stringing together 7 stars, met in its advance, like beads on a rosary. The largest of these is apparently the occasion of a slight deviation from its otherwise rectilinear course. A second similar but shorter streak runs, likewise east and west, through the midst of the formation. 229:1 Nebulosities of the Pleiades. Nebulosities of the Pleiades. Photographed by Dr. Max Wolf, Heidelberg. To list later photographs have shown that not only are the several stars of the Pleiades linked together by nebulous filaments, but the whole cluster is embedded in a nebulous net that spreads its meshes far out into space. Not only is the group thus tied or bound together by nebulous clouds, it has other tokens of forming but a single family. The movements of the several stars have been carefully measured, and for the most part the entire cluster is drifting in the same direction. A few stars do not share in the common motion, and are probably apparent members, seen in perspective projected on the group, but in reality much nearer to us. The members of the group also show a family likeness in constitution. When the spectroscope is turned upon it, the chief stars are seen to closely resemble each other, the principal lines in their spectra being those of hydrogen, and these are seen as broad and diffused bands, so that the spectrum we see resembles that of the brightest star of the heavens, Sirius. There can be little doubt but that the leaders of the group are actually greater, brighter suns than Sirius itself. We do not know the exact distance of the Pleiades, they are so far off that we can scarcely do more than make a guess at it, but it is probable that they are so far distant that our sun at like distance would prove much too faint to be seen at all by the naked eye. The Pleiades then would seem to be a most glorious star system, not yet come to its full growth. From the standpoint of modern science we may interpret the chain, or the sweet influences, of the Pleiades as consisting in the enfolding wisps of nebulosity which still, as it were, knit together those vast young suns, or, and in all probability more truly, as that mysterious force of gravitation which holds the mighty system together, and in obedience to which the group has taken its present shape. The question, if asked us today, would be, in effect, canst thou bind together by nebulous chains scores of suns, far more glorious than thine own, and scattered over many millions of miles of space, or canst thou loosen the attraction which those suns exercise upon each other, and move them hither and thither at thy will? Footnotes 217:1, Glossary of Greek Birds, pp. 28, 29. 221:1, R. H. Allen, Star Names and Their Meanings, page 401. 223:1, Barakoff, Folios 59, Kernel 1. 229:1, The System of the Stars, First Edit. Pages 230 to 232. Chapter 7 Orion Kezel, the word rendered by our translators, Orion, occurs in an astronomical sense 4 times in the scriptures, twice in the book of Job, once in the prophecy of Amos, and once, in the plural, in the prophecy of Isaiah. In the 3 first cases the word is used in conjunction with Chema, the Pleiades, as shown in the preceding chapter. The 4th instance is rendered in the Authorized Version, "For the stars of heaven and the constellations, Kezalim, thereof shall not give their light." The Hebrew word kezel signifies a fool, and that in the general sense of the term as used in Scripture, not merely a silly, untaught, feckless person, but a godless and an impious one. Thus, in the book of Proverbs, divine wisdom is represented as appealing, "How long, ye simple ones, will ye love simplicity? The scorners delight in their scorning, and fools hate knowledge." The stars of Orion. The stars of Orion. To list what constellation was known to the ancient Hebrews as the Fool. The 70 who rendered the Old Testament into Greek confess themselves at fault. Once, in Amos, both Chema and Kezel are left untranslated. Instead of "him that mocketh the 7 stars and Orion," we have the paraphrase, "that mocketh and transformeth all things." Once, in Job, it is rendered Hesperus, the evening star, and in the other 2 instances it is given as Orion. The tradition of the real meaning of the word as an astronomical term had been lost, or at least much confused before the Septuagint version was undertaken. The Jews had not, so far as there is any present evidence, learned the term in Babylon, for the word has not yet been found as a star name on any cuneiform inscription. It was well known before the exile, for Amos and Isaiah both use it, and the fact that the author of Job also uses it, indicates that he did not gain his knowledge of the constellation during the Babylonian captivity. The majority of translators and commentators have, however, agreed in believing that the brightest and most splendid constellation in the sky is intended, the one which we know as Orion. This constellation is one of the very few in which the natural grouping of the stars seems to suggest the figure that has been connected with it. For bright stars, in a great trapezium, are taken to mark the 2 shoulders and the 2 legs of a gigantic warrior. A row of 3 bright stars, midway between the 4 first named, suggest his gemmed belt. Another row of stars straight down from the center star of the belt, presents his sword. A compact cluster of 3 stars marks his head. A gigantic warrior, armed for the battle, seems thus to be outlined in the heavens. As Longfellow describes him, begirt with many a blazing star, stood the great giant, Aljabar, Orion, hunter of the beast. His sword hung gleaming by his side, and, on his arm, the lion's hide scattered across the midnight air the golden radiance of its hair. In accord with the form naturally suggested by the grouping of the stars, the Syrians have called the constellation Gabra, and the Arabs, Al-Jabbar, and the Jews, Gibber. The brightest star of the constellation, the one in the left knee, now generally known as Rigel, is still occasionally called Aljabar, a corruption of Al-Jabbar, though one of the fainter stars near it now bears that name. The meaning in each case is, the giant, the mighty one, the great warrior, and no doubt from the first formation of the constellations, this, the most brilliant of all, was understood to set forth a warrior armed for the battle. There were Gibberim before the flood. We are told that after, the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, and they bare children to them, the same became mighty men, Gibberim, which were of old, men of renown. But according to Jewish tradition, this constellation was appropriated to himself by a particular mighty man. We are told in Gen X that, Cush begot Nimrod, he began to be a mighty one, Gibber, in the earth, and it is alleged that he, or his courtiers, in order to flatter him, gave his name to this constellation, just as thousands of years later the University of Leipzig proposed to call the belt stars of Orion, Stelli Napoleonis, the constellation of Napoleon. 234:1, there was at one time surprise felt, that, deeply as the name of Nimrod had impressed itself upon Eastern tradition, his name, as such, was nowhere found in the extensive literature which has come down to us from Babylon. It is now considered that the word, Nimrod, is simply a Hebrew variant of Merodach, the well-known head of the Babylonian pantheon. He was probably the first king of Babylonia or the first really great ruler of the country. It is significant, as Mr. T. G. Pinches points out, in his Old Testament in the light of the records from Assyria and Babylonia, that just as in Genesis it is stated that the beginning of his, Nimrod's, kingdom was Babel, and Erech, and Akkad, and Calneh, so Merodach is stated, in the cuneiform records, to have built Babel and Erech and Niffer, which last is probably Calneh. The Hebrew scribes would seem to have altered the name of Merodach in two particulars. They dropped the last syllable, thus suggesting that the name was derived from Mered, the rebellious one, and they prefixed the syllable ni, just as Nisroch was written for Assur. From a linguistic point of view, therefore, the identification of Nimrod as a changed form of Merodach is fully justified. Orion and the neighboring constellations. Orion and the neighboring constellations. To list the attitude of Orion in the sky is a striking one. The warrior is represented as holding a club in the right hand, and a skin or shield in the left. His left foot is raised high as if he were climbing a steep ascent. He seems to be endeavoring to force his way up into the zodiac, and, as Longfellow expresses it, to be beating the forehead of the bull. His right leg is not shown below the knee, for immediately beneath him is the little constellation of the Hare, by the early Arabs sometimes called, al-Kursi al-Jabbar, the chair of the giant, from its position. Behind Orion are the two dogs, each constellation distinguished by a very brilliant star, the greater dog, by Sirius, the brightest star in the heavens, the lesser dog, by Procyon, i.e. the dog's forerunner. Not far above Orion, on the shoulder of the bull, is the little cluster of the Pleiades. There are, as we have seen, only 3 passages where Chema, literally, the cluster, or company, the group we know as the Pleiades, is mentioned in Scripture, and in each case it is associated with Kezel, the fool, Orion. Several Greek poets give us the same association, likening the stars to rock pigeons, flying from the hunter Orion. And Hesiod in his works in Days writes, "Do not to plough forget, when the 7 virgins, and Orion, set, thus an advantage always shall appear, in every labour of the various year. If o'er your mind prevails the love of gain, and tempts you to the dangers of the main, yet in her harbour safe the vessel keep, when strong Orion chases to the deep the virgin stars." There is a suggestion of intense irony in this position of Orion amongst the other constellations. He is trampling on the Hare, most timid of creatures, he is climbing up into the zodiac to chase the little company of the Pleiades, be they 7 doves or 7 maidens, and he is thwarted even in this unheroic attempt by the determined attitude of the guardian bull. A similar irony is seen in the Hebrew name for the constellation. The mighty hunter, the great hero whom the Babylonians had deified and made their supreme god, the Hebrews regarded as the fool, the impious rebel. Since Orion is Nimrod, that is Merodach, there is small wonder that Kezel was not recognized as his name in Babylonia. 238:1, the attitude of Orion, attempting to force his way upward into the zodiac, and the identification of Merodach with him, gives emphasis to Isaiah's reproach, many centuries later, against the king of Babylon, the successor of Merodach. "Thou hast said in thine heart, I will ascend into heaven, I will exalt my throne above the stars of God, I will sit also upon the mount of the congregation. In the sides of the north, I will ascend above the heights of the clouds, I will be like the Most High." In the sight of the Hebrew prophets and poets, Merodach, in taking to himself this group of stars, published his shame and folly. He had ascended into heaven, but his glittering belt was only his fetter, he was bound and gibbeted in the sky like a captive, or rebel, and who could loose his bands? In the 13th chapter of Isaiah we have the plural of Kezel, Kezelim. It is usually understood that we have here Orion, as the most splendid constellation in the sky, put for the constellations in general. But if we remember that Kezel stands for Nimrod or Merodach, the first proud tyrant mentioned by name in Scripture, the particular significance of the allusion becomes evident. "Behold, the day of the Lord cometh, cruel both with wrath and fierce anger, to lay the land desolate, and he shall destroy the sinners thereof out of it. For the stars of heavens and the constellations, that is the Kezelim, the Nimrods or Merodachs of the sky, thereof shall not give their light, the sun shall be darkened in his going forth, and the moon shall not cause her light to shine. And I will punish the world for their evil, and the wicked for their iniquity, and I will cause the arrogancy of the proud to cease, and will lay low the haughtiness of the terrible. The strictly astronomical relations of Orion and the Pleiades seem to be hinted at in Amos and in Job. Seek him that mocketh the 7 stars and Orion, and turneth the shadow of death into the morning, and mocketh the day dark with night. In this passage the parallelism seems to be between the 7 stars, the Pleiades, with sunrise, and Orion with sunset. Now at the time and place when the constellations were mapped out, the Pleiades were the immediate heralds of sunrise, shortly after the spring equinox, at the season which would correspond to the early part of April in our present calendar. The rising of Orion at sunset, his acronical rising, was early in December, about the time when the coldest season of the year begins. The astronomical meaning of the bands of Orion would therefore be the rigor in which the earth is held during the cold of winter. It is possible that the 2 great stars which follow Orion, Sirius and Procyon, known to the ancients generally and to us today as the dogs, were by the Babylonians known as the bow star and the lance star, the weapons, that is to say, of Orion or Merodach. Jensen identifies Sirius with the bow star, but considers that the lance star was Antares. Hamel, however, identifies the lance star with Procyon. In the 5th tablet of the Babylonian creation epic as translated by Dr. L. W. King, there is an interesting account of the placing of the bow star in the heavens. After Merodach had killed Tiamat, 75. The gods, his fathers, beheld the net which he had made, 76. They beheld the bow and how its work was accomplished. 77. They praised the work which he had done. 78. Then Anu raised in the assembly of the gods. 79. He kissed the bow, saying, It is. 80. And thus he named the names of the bow, saying, 81. Longwood shall be one name, and the second name shall be 82. And its third name shall be the bow star, in heaven shall it. 83. Then he fixed a station for it. Dr. Shane even considers that he has found a reference to these 2 stars in Job 38. 36. Who hath put wisdom in the inward parts, lance star, or who hath given understanding to the heart, bow star. But this interpretation does not appear to have been generally accepted. The same high authority suggests that the astronomical allusions in Amos may have been inserted by a post-exilic editor, thus accounting for the occurrence of the same astronomical terms as are found in Job, which he assigns to the exilic or post-exilic period. This seems a dangerous expedient, as it might with equal reason be used in many other directions. Further, it entirely fails to explain the real difficulty that Kema and Kezel have not been found as Babylonian constellation names, and that their astronomical signification had been lost by the time that the 70 undertook their labors. Quite apart from the fact that the Babylonians could not give the name of fool to the representation in the sky of their supreme deity, the Hebrews and the Babylonians regarded the constellation in different ways. Several Assyriologists consider that the constellations, Orion and Cetus, represent the struggle between Merodach and Tiamat, and this conjecture is probably correct, so far as Babylonian ideas of the constellations are concerned, for Tiamat is expressly identified on a Babylonian tablet with a constellation near the ecliptic. 241:1, but this means that the myth originated in the star figures, and was the Babylonian interpretation of them. In this case, Cetus, that is Tiamat, must have been considered as a goddess, and as directly and immediately the ancestress of all the gods. Orion, Merodach, must have been likewise a god, the great-great-grandson of Tiamat, whom he destroys. The Hebrew conception was altogether different. Neither Merodach, nor Tiamat, nor the constellations of Orion and Cetus, nor the actual stars of which they are composed, are anything but creatures. Jehovah has made Orion, as well as the 7 stars, as his hand hath formed the crooked serpent. By the mouth of Isaiah he says, I form the light, and create darkness, I make peace, and create evil, I the Lord, do all these things. The Babylonian view was of 2 divinities pitted against each other, and the evil divinity was the original and the originator of the good. In the Hebrew view, even the powers of evil are created things, they are not self-existent. And the Hebrews took a different view from the Babylonians of the story told by these constellations. The Hebrews always coupled Orion with the Pleiades, the Babylonians coupled Orion with Cetus, that is, Merodach with Tiamat. The view that has come down to us through the Greeks agrees much better with the association of the constellations as held amongst the Hebrews, rather than amongst the Babylonians. The hunter Orion, according to the Greeks, chased the Pleiades, the little company of 7 virgins, or 7 doves, and he was confronted by the bull. In their view, too, the sea monster was not warring against Orion, but against the chained woman, Andromeda. Footnotes, 234:1, but the fact that Napoleon's name was thus coupled with this constellation does not warrant us in asserting that Napoleon had no historical existence, and that his long contest with the great sea power, England, with its capital on the River Thames, Tiham, was only a stellar myth, arising from the nearness of Orion to the sea monster in the sky, a variant, in fact, of the great Babylonian myth of Marduk and Tiamat, the dragon of the deep. It seems necessary to make this remark, since the process of astrologizing history, whether derived from the Bible or from secular writers, has been carried very far. Thus Dr. H. Winkler writes down the account of the first 3 Persian kings, given us by Herodotus, as myths of Ares, Taurus, and Gemini. David and Goliath, too, are but Marduk and Tiamat, or Orion and Cetus, but David has become the giant, and Goliath the dragon, for Goliath is claimed as a wordplay on the Babylonian Galitu, ocean. Examining an Arabic globe of date 1279 AD, that is to say some 4,000 years after the constellations were devised, Dr. Winkler found that Orion was represented as left-handed. He therefore used this left-handed Orion as the link of identification between Ehud, the left-handed judge of Israel, and Tyr, the left-handed Mars of the Scandinavian pantheon. Dr. Winkler seems to have been unaware of the elementary fact that a celestial globe necessarily shows its figures inside out. We look up to the sky, to see the actual constellations from within the sphere, we look down upon a celestial globe from without, and hence see the designs upon it as in the looking-glass. 238:1, Dr. Shane says, in a note on page 52 of Job and Solomon, Heb-Ksil, the name of the foolhardy giant who strove with Jehovah. The Chaldeo-Assyrian astrology gave the name Kislev to the 9th month, connecting it with the zodiacal sign Sagittarius. But there are valid reasons for attaching the Hebrew popular myth to Orion. So Colonel Conder, in page 179 of the Hittites and Their Language, translates the name of the Assyrian 9th month, Sislu, as giant. Now Sagittarius is in the heavens just opposite to Orion, so when in the 9th month the sun was in conjunction with Sagittarius, Orion was in opposition. In Sislu, therefore, the giant, Orion, was riding the heavens all night, occupying the chamber of the south at midnight, so that the 9th month might well be called the month of the giant. 241:1, Dr. L. W. King, Tablets of Creation, Appendix 3. Page 208. Chapter 8 Mazzaroth. We have no assistance from any cuneiform inscriptions as to the astronomical significance of Aish, Kema, and Kezel, but the case is different when we come to Mazzaroth. In the 5th tablet of the Babylonian creation epic we read, 1. He, Marduk, made the stations for the great gods, 2. The stars, their images, as the stars of the zodiac, he fixed. 3. He ordained the year, and into sections, Mizrata, he divided it, 4. For the 12 months he fixed 3 stars. 5. After he had the days of the year. Images 6. He founded the station of Nibber to determine their bounds, 7. That none might err or go astray. 8. He set the station of Bel and Ea along with him. In the 3rd line Mizrata, cognate with the Hebrew Mazzaroth, means the sections or divisions of the year, corresponding to the signs of the zodiac mentioned in the 2nd line. There can therefore be little doubt that the translators who gave us our English versions are practically correct in the rendering of Job 38:32 which they give in the margin, Canst thou bring forth Mazzaroth, or the 12 signs, in his season? The foregoing extract from the fifth tablet of creation has no small astronomical interest. Merodach is represented as setting in order the heavenly bodies. First of all he allots their stations to the great gods, dividing to them the constellations of the zodiac, and the months of the year, so that the arrangement by which every month had its tutelary deity or deities, is here said to be his work. Next, he divides up the constellations of the zodiac, not merely arranging the actual stars, but appropriating to each constellation its special design or image. Third, he divides up the year to correspond with the zodiac, making 12 months with 3 stars or constellations to each. In other words, he carries the division of the zodiac a step further, and divides each sign into 3 equal parts, the decans of the astrologers, each containing 10 degrees, deca, of the ecliptic. The statement made in line 4 refers to an important development of astronomy. The constellations of the zodiac, that is, the groups made up of the actual stars, are very unequal in size and irregular in shape. The numerous theories, ancient or modern, in which the constellations are supposed to owe their origin to the distinctive weather of the successive months, each constellation figure being a sort of hieroglyph for its particular month, are therefore all manifestly erroneous, for there never could have been any real fixed or steady correlation between the constellations and the months. Similarly, the theories which claim that the ancient names for the months were derived from the constellations are equally untenable. Some writers have even held both classes of theory, overlooking the fact that they mutually contradict each other. But there came a time when the inconvenience of the unequal division of the zodiac by the constellations was felt to be an evil, and it was remedied by dividing the ecliptic into 12 equal parts, each part being called after the constellation with which it corresponded most nearly at the time such division was made. These equal divisions have been called the signs of the zodiac. It must be clearly understood that they have always and at all times been imaginary divisions of the heavens, that they were never associated with real stars. They were simply a picturesque mode of expressing celestial longitude, the distance of a star from the place of the sun at the spring equinox, as measured along the ecliptic, the sun's apparent path during the year. The signs once arranged, the next step was an easy one. Each sign was equivalent to 30 degrees of longitude. A third of a sign, a decan, was 10 degrees of longitude, corresponding to the week of 10 days used in Egypt and in Greece. This change from the constellations to the signs cannot have taken place very early. The place of the spring equinox travels backwards amongst the stars at the rate of very little more than a degree in 72 years. When the change was made, the spring equinox was somewhere in the constellation Aries, the Ram, and therefore Aries was then adopted as the first sign, and must always remain such, since the signs move amongst the stars with the equinox. Position of spring equinox, B.C. 2700. Position of spring equinox, B.C. 2700. To list we cannot fix when this change was made within a few years, but it cannot have been before the time when the sun at the spring equinox was situated just below Hamal, the brightest star of the Ram. This was about 700 B.C. The equal division of the zodiac must have taken place not earlier than this, and with it, the bull must have been deposed from the position it had always held up to that time, of leader of the zodiac. It is probable that some direct method of determining the equinox itself was introduced much about the same time. This new system involved nothing short of a revolution in astronomy, but the Babylonian creation story implies that this revolution had already taken place when it was composed, and that the equal division of the zodiac was already in force. It is possible that the 6th and 7th lines of the poem indicate that the Babylonians had already noticed a peculiar fact, viz. that just as the moon passes through all the signs in a month, whilst the sun passes through only one sign in that time, so the sun passes through all the signs in a year, whilst Jupiter passes through but one sign. Nibur was the special Babylonian name of the planet Jupiter when on the meridian, and Merodach, as the deity of that planet, is thus represented as pacing out the bounds of the zodiacal signs by his movement in the course of the year. The planet also marks out the third part of a sign, i.e. 10 degrees, for during 1/3 of each year it appears to retrograde, moving from east to west amongst the stars instead of from west to east. During this retrogression it covers the breadth of 1 decan equals 10 degrees. Position of spring equinox, d. 1900. Position of spring equinox, d. 1900. To list the Babylonian creation epoch is therefore quite late, for it introduces astronomical ideas not current earlier than 700 BC in Babylonia or anywhere else. This new development of astronomy enables us also to roughly date the origin of the different orders of systematic astrology. Astrology, like astronomy, has passed through successive stages. It began at 0. An unexpected event in the heavens was accounted portentous, because it was unexpected, and it was interpreted in a good or bad sense according to the state of mind of the beholder. There can have been at first no system, no order, no linking up of one specific kind of prediction with one kind of astronomical event. It can have been originally nothing but a crude jumble of omens, just on a level with the superstitions of some of our peasantry as to seeing hares, or cats, or magpies, and the earliest astrological tablets from Mesopotamia are precisely of this character. But the official fortune-tellers at the courts of the kings of Nineveh or Babylon must speedily have learned the necessity of arranging some systems of prediction for their own protection, systems definite enough to give the astrologer a groundwork for a prediction which he could claim was dependent simply upon the heavenly bodies, and hence for which the astrologer could not be held personally responsible, and at the same time elastic enough to enable him to shape his prediction to fit in with his patron's wishes. The astrology of today shows the same essential features. This necessity explains the early Babylonian tablets with catalogues of eclipses on all days of the month, and in all quarters of the sky. The great majority of the eclipses could never happen, but they could be, nonetheless, made use of by a court magician. If an eclipse of the sun took place on the 29th day and in the south, he could always point out how exceedingly unpleasant things might have been for the king and the country if he, the magician, had not by his diligence, prevented its happening, say, on the 20th, and in the north. A Zulu witch doctor is quite equal to analogous subterfuges today, and no doubt his Babylonian congeners were not less ingenious 3,000 years ago. Such subterfuges were not always successful when a Shaka or a Nebuchadnezzar had to be dealt with, but with kings of a more ordinary type either in Zululand or Mesopotamia they would answer well enough. Coming down to times when astronomy had so far advanced that a catalogue of the stars had been drawn up, with their positions determined by actual measurement, it became possible for astrologers to draw up something like a definite system of prediction, based upon the constellations or parts of a constellation that happened to be rising at any given moment, and this was the system employed when Zuchros of Babylon wrote in the 1st century of our era. His system must have been started later than 700 B.C., for in it Aries is considered as the leader of the zodiac, the constellations are already disestablished in favor of the signs, and the signs are each divided into 3. A practical drawback to this particular astrological system was that the aspect presented by the heavens on one evening was precisely the same as that presented on the next evening 4 minutes earlier. The field for prediction therefore was very limited and repeated itself too much for the purpose of fortune-tellers. The introduction of the planets into astrology gave a greater diversity to the material used by the fortune-tellers. An early phase of planetary astrology consisted in the allotment of a planet to each hour of the day and also to each day of the week. It has been already shown in the chapter on Saturn and Astrology, that this system arose from the Ptolemaic idea of the solar system grafted on the Egyptian division of the day into 24 hours, and applied to the week of 7 days. It probably originated in Alexandria, and arose not earlier than the 3rd century before our era. Mathematical astrology, the complex system now in vogue, involves a considerable knowledge of the apparent movements of the planets and a development of mathematics such as did not exist until the days of Hipparchus. It also employs the purely imaginary signs of the zodiac, not the constellations, and reckons the first point of Aries as at the spring equinox. So far as we can ascertain, the spring equinox marked the first point of the constellation Aries about B.C. 110. All these varied forms of astrology are therefore comparatively recent. Before that it was of course reckoned ominous if an eclipse took place, or a comet was seen, or a bright planet came near the moon, just as spilling salt or crossing knives may be reckoned ominous today. The omens had as little to do with observation, or with anything that could be called scientific, in the one case as in the other. It is important to realize that astrology, as anything more than the crude observance of omens, is younger than astronomy by at least 2,000 years. Mazzaroth occurs only once in the Bible, viz. in Job 38. 32, already so often quoted, but a similar word Mazzaroth occurs in 2 Kings 23. 5, where it is said that Josiah put down the idolatrous priests, them also that burned incense unto Baal, to the sun, and to the moon, and to the planets,